I didn't notice the change until it was too late. Maybe it had always been there, subtle and slow, creeping into the corners of my life like a spider spinning its web. Or maybe it came all at once, the way night swallows the last light of day. Either way, by the time I realized what was happening, it already had its hooks in me. It began with the photos. One morning, I found a Polaroid on my desk at work. I don't own a Polaroid camera. The image was of my bedroom, familiar, down to the unmade bed and the stack of books teetering on the nightstand. The angle suggested it was taken from the foot of my bed, but I hadn't been there when it was taken. I was sure of that. I asked around, but no one admitted to leaving the photo. Weird prank, my coworker Eric said, shrugging. You sure you didn't take it yourself? I wasn't sure of anything, but I shoved the photo into my bag and tried to move on. That night, another Polaroid was waiting for me when I got home. This one was on my kitchen table, propped up against a glass of water I hadn't poured. It showed the hallway just outside my apartment door. Empty, dimly lit, and utterly ordinary, except for a faint blur in the far corner of the frame. I didn't touch the photo. I didn't touch the water. By the third day, they started appearing more frequently. On my couch, in my fridge, tucked between the pages of my books, always showing the same thing. A piece of my life, but slightly off. The clock in my living room frozen at a time I couldn't remember. My reflection in the bathroom mirror, blurred like I was in motion when I wasn't. A dark, indistinct figure standing just outside my bedroom window in one frame, gone in the next. I stopped sleeping. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the pipes, sent my pulse racing. I started keeping a knife under my pillow, though I wasn't sure what I thought I'd do with it. Whatever was happening wasn't something I could fight. Then the photos began to change. They weren't of my apartment anymore. One showed a dense forest, the trees gnarled and twisted like they'd been pulled straight from a nightmare. Another showed an empty playground under a heavy gray sky. The swings moved in a wind I couldn't feel. I didn't recognize these places, but they filled me with a deep, primal unease. I knew, somehow, that these were not places I'd ever want to go. And then, one morning, I woke up to find a photo on my pillow. It showed me. I was standing in my bedroom, but I wasn't looking at the camera. I was looking at something just out of frame, my face caught in a mix of fear and recognition. My hands were raised, palms out, like I was trying to ward something off. I wanted to scream, to throw the photo across the room, but I couldn't bring myself to move. My body felt heavy, pinned by the weight of some unseen force. The photos became more frequent after that. They showed me in places I didn't remember being. Walking down an unfamiliar street, standing in the aisle of a grocery store I'd never shopped at, sitting on a park bench next to a man I didn't know. Sometimes, the figure from the earlier photos appeared with me, standing too close, its features still impossible to make out. I started finding Polaroids in my bag, in my pockets, even taped to my bathroom mirror. My own image stared back at me from every angle, and in each photo, my expression grew more and more afraid. One night, as I sat on the floor of my living room, surrounded by the photos, my phone buzzed. It was a text message. "Come outside." I didn't move. The message buzzed again, and again. Each time, the sender's number was different. Each time, the message was the same. Finally, my phone rang. The caller ID was blank, and when I picked it up, there was no voice on the other end. Just the faint, rhythmic clicking of a camera shutter. I don't remember hanging up. The next day, I boarded up my windows and shoved a chair under the door handle. I disconnected my phone and threw it in the trash. But the photos still came. They showed me in my boarded-up apartment, staring out through the slats like I was waiting for something. They showed me in places I knew I hadn't been, doing things I didn't remember doing, standing on a street corner with my head tilted unnaturally to one side, sitting at a desk I didn't recognize, my hands poised over a typewriter. The final photo came this morning. It wasn't left on my desk or my kitchen counter or slipped under the door. It was in my hand when I woke up. The image showed a room I didn't recognize, dimly lit and bare except for a single chair. Someone was sitting in the chair, but it wasn't me. It looked like me, same face, same clothes, but it wasn't. I could tell by the way it smiled. The expression didn't belong to me. It was sharp, cold, and hungry. As I stared at the photo, The lights in my apartment flickered. The air grew cold, heavy, like the pressure before a storm. And then I heard it, the faint click of a camera shutter. But this time, it came from behind me. The cabin was cheap, and I needed cheap. It sat on a forgotten stretch of lakefront deep in the northern woods, surrounded by old pines and an air of long-neglected solitude. The landlord, a man who seemed desperate for someone to take it off his hands, had waved away most of my questions when I asked about the price. "Just keep it tidy," he'd said, handing over the keys. "And don't mess with the crawl space." That last part stuck with me as I drove up the dirt road. The crawl space. It sounded harmless enough, but the way he said it carried weight, like a warning whispered too late. I told myself it was probably structural, rotting beams, maybe, or old wiring. Something unremarkable. The cabin itself was nothing special. A squat, one-story structure with peeling paint and a sagging roofline. Inside, it smelled of damp wood and mothballs, with an undercurrent of something sharper, like iron. But it had a bed, a kitchen, and a view of the lake so pristine it looked like it had been plucked from a postcard. That was enough. The first night, I lay awake, the kind of restless that comes from sleeping in a new place. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and the lake lapped gently against the shore. It should have been peaceful, but there was a tension in the air, like the cabin itself was holding its breath. By morning, I had mostly convinced myself it was nerves. Moving away from the city had been abrupt, a last-minute decision born of necessity, not planning. I made coffee, unpacked my books, and spent the afternoon walking the shoreline, trying to shake the unease. The lake was glassy and still, its surface too smooth for the restless breeze that stirred the pines. Something about that struck me as odd, but I told myself it was just the strange equilibrium of nature. The crawl space didn't come to mind again until the third day, when I heard the sound. I was in the living room, flipping through an old magazine I'd found stuffed in a cabinet, when a faint knock drifted up through the floorboards. It was soft at first, like a branch brushing against the cabin's siding, but it grew sharper, more insistent. I froze, the magazine slipping from my hands. It stopped as abruptly as it had started. I told myself it was an animal, a raccoon or a stray cat, maybe, but the sound wasn't random. It was rhythmic, deliberate. I stared at the floor for a long time, waiting for it to come again. When it didn't, I forced myself to laugh it off. It was just a cabin noise, I decided. Old wood settling, a draft finding its way through cracks. Nothing worth losing sleep over. The knocking came again that night, louder this time, waking me just after midnight. I bolted upright, my pulse hammering in my throat. It wasn't the random clatter of a rodent or the creak of warped timber. It was a pattern. 3 knocks, a pause, and then 2 more. I swung my legs off the bed and padded into the living room, barefoot and half daring myself to investigate. "Hello?" My voice sounded thin in the silence. The cabin swallowed the word, offering no reply. I waited for the knocks to return, but instead, I heard a faint scraping, like nails dragging along the underside of the floorboards. It moved slowly, tracing a path beneath me, until it stopped directly under my feet. I didn't breathe. The landlord's warning about the crawl space came back to me then, unbidden and unwelcome. I had avoided it out of respect and maybe a little fear, but now it felt like an obligation, a dare I couldn't ignore. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out into the night. The crawl space door was a warped wooden panel at the back of the cabin, secured by a rusty latch. When I unhooked it, the door swung open with a groan, revealing a dark, narrow void. The air that rushed out smelled of damp earth and rot, thick enough to gag on. I crouched down, aiming the flashlight into the opening, but the beam barely penetrated the gloom. Something moved. I couldn't tell what it was, just a flicker of motion at the edge of the light, so fast it might have been a trick of the shadows. My heart hammered, but I leaned closer, angling the flashlight into the crawl space. The dirt floor was disturbed, furrows carved into the earth as though something had been dragged across it. My stomach churned, and then I saw it, a handprint pressed deep into the dirt. It was too large to be human, the fingers elongated, the palm impossibly wide. My throat tightened, but before I could think to run, the knocking started again. This time, it wasn't beneath the cabin. It was coming from the trees behind me. I turned, flashlight trembling. The beams swept across the forest, catching nothing but endless trunks and tangled undergrowth. The sound continued, louder now, echoing off the trees like a taunt. Knock, knock, knock. 3 beats, a pause, then 2 more. The light wavered, and for a moment, I thought I saw something in the shadows. A tall figure, its limbs bent at unnatural angles, its head cocked as if listening. And then it was gone, slipping between the trees with a fluidity that made my stomach churn. I didn't sleep that night. The knocking came and went in bursts, each time moving closer, then farther away, as if circling the cabin. By dawn, it stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. It felt deliberate, expectant. When the landlord called the next day to check in, I told him about the noises, the crawl space, the handprint. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before he spoke. "You didn't open it, did you? The crawl space?" I hesitated, my throat dry. "Just the door. I didn't go inside." He sighed, the kind of sigh that carried weight, the sound of a man resigning himself to something inevitable. "Pack your things," he said. "Leave before dark." "What? Why?" "Just go. And whatever you do, don't let it follow you." The line went dead. I left that afternoon, throwing my bags into the car and tearing down the dirt road without looking back. The knocking followed me for miles, faint at first, then louder, tapping against the car windows in a rhythm I knew too well. It still comes, even now, weeks later. In the walls of my apartment, in the pipes, in my dreams. I hear it at night, patient and steady, waiting for me to open the door again. They say you can feel when something shifts, not like a sharp snap, but a subtle tilt, a crack forming beneath your feet while you're too busy looking at the horizon. For me, it was the smell of cedarwood. It drifted into our home one evening, faint but persistent, as if someone had opened the door to let in autumn. He was already in the living room, leaning back on the couch with his laptop balanced on his knees. The scent was unfamiliar. He never wore cologne, let alone something as sophisticated as cedarwood. "What's that smell?" I asked casually, placing the groceries on the counter. He looked up, startled, as if I'd caught him mid-sentence in a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. "What smell?" he asked, sniffing the air theatrically. I didn't press. It seemed small at the time, something not worth chasing. But over the weeks, the scent lingered, clinging to his clothes, his skin, even his car when I borrowed it one afternoon. The cedarwood wasn't alone. He started carrying a leather notebook, one I'd never seen before, its corners worn as if it had been thumbed through countless times. He always kept it close, stuffing it into his bag when he left or locking it in his desk drawer. It fascinated me, that notebook, because it wasn't the kind of thing he ever used. He was a tech guy, every thought typed into apps, every reminder pinging from his phone. Then there was the lighter. It sat on the bathroom sink one morning, its brass surface catching the sunlight. I turned it over in my hands, puzzled. He didn't smoke. Neither did I. When I asked him about it later, he shrugged. "Oh, that. A guy at work left it in my car. I forgot to give it back." I didn't believe him, but I let it slide. By then, the questions were piling up faster than I could unpack them. He'd started coming home later, muttering vague excuses about work deadlines and networking events. His wardrobe shifted subtly, too. New shirts and colors he never used to wear. A tie that looked suspiciously expensive for his usual thrifty habits. One night, while he was in the shower, I found myself opening his desk drawer. The notebook lay on top, the leather warm and soft under my fingers. I hesitated, my pulse thudding in my ears. Flipping it open felt like crossing a line I wasn't ready for. But my curiosity burned brighter than my guilt. The pages were filled with sketches, beautiful, intricate designs of jewelry. Rings, necklaces, bracelets, each one detailed with tiny annotations about gemstones and settings. My breath caught. He wasn't an artist, and he'd never mentioned an interest in jewelry. When I confronted him later, he barely flinched. "I'm working on a surprise for you," he said, the words smooth and practiced. "I wanted to design something unique." That's why I've been so secretive. I should have been touched, but something in his tone felt wrong. It wasn't the words themselves. It was the lack of warmth, like a song played in the wrong key. A few nights later, he said he had to work late again. I waited until his car disappeared down the street before grabbing my jacket. I didn't know what I was looking for, only that I couldn't ignore the gnawing in my gut any longer. I ended up at a small cafe downtown, the kind with dim lighting and mismatched chairs. His car was parked a block away, and through the window, I saw him sitting at a corner table. He wasn't alone. The woman across from him leaned in close, her laugh bright enough to cut through the glass. She reached out, touching his hand, and I saw him smile in a way he hadn't smiled at me in months. It wasn't the smile itself that hurt. It was how easy it looked, how natural. I didn't go inside. I couldn't. Instead, I stood there on the sidewalk, my breath clouding the window, until the waitress brought their check and they left together. When he came home that night, he kissed me on the cheek like nothing had happened. He smelled like cedarwood. For days, I carried the image of them like a stone in my chest. I wanted to scream, to throw accusations, to demand an explanation. But every time I opened my mouth, the words caught in my throat. Instead, I waited. The breaking point came a week later, when he left his phone on the counter while he went to shower. The screen lit up with a message. I'm still wearing it. It feels perfect. Smiling face with smiling eyes. I didn't need to open the rest of the thread. I already knew. That evening, I laid the notebook on the table between us. I found this, I said quietly. He stared at it, his expression unreadable. I told you, it's for you. Stop, I interrupted. My voice was calm, but my hands trembled. Just tell me the truth, please. For a moment, I thought he might. His shoulders sagged, his eyes heavy with something I couldn't name. But then he shook his head and stood, walking toward the door. I can't do this right now, he said. The door closed behind him, and I knew he wasn't coming back. In the days that followed, I gathered the fragments of our life together. The shirts that smelled like cedarwood, the lighter, the sketches. I put them in a box and shoved it into the back of a closet. Months later, I found myself in that same cafe, sipping coffee alone. A woman walked in, wearing a necklace that caught the light like a spark. I recognized the design immediately. She didn't see me, but I watched her sit down at the same table, smiling at a new man across from her. He laughed, leaning in close, his hand brushing hers. And just like that, I let go. I've been renting this apartment for 6 months, and until recently, it felt like the best decision I ever made. It's in a quiet neighborhood, with big windows that let in plenty of light and an affordable rent that made me suspicious at first. The landlord seemed almost too eager to have me move in, but I brushed it off. People get weird about money sometimes. The first few months passed without issue. I settled in, got to know the quirks of the place. The finicky water pressure, the way the floorboards in the kitchen creaked no matter how lightly you stepped. I even grew to appreciate the old radiator in the living room that hissed like it was trying to whisper secrets. Then I found the door. It was in the bedroom closet. I'd been using the closet regularly, hanging clothes, stashing old boxes. But one night, while reorganizing, I noticed the faint outline of a second door carved into the back wall. At first, I thought it was just a defect in the wood. But when I pressed on it, the panel shifted slightly, like it wasn't secured properly. I should have stopped there, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and pried at the edges until the panel gave way. Behind it was a small, dark passage, barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. It wasn't just an empty void, though. The passage led somewhere. I could see the faint glow of light at the far end. I should have closed the panel and forgotten about it, but something about that light made it impossible to look away. It wasn't warm or inviting. It was cold, bluish, and pulsing faintly, like it was alive. Against my better judgment, I climbed in. The passage smelled damp and metallic, like rust and wet stone. The walls were rough, scraping against my shoulders as I moved. It was longer than I expected, the light at the end seeming no closer no matter how far I crawled. My breathing grew shallow, my heartbeat thudding louder in my ears. Finally, the passage opened into a room. It was small, barely larger than the crawl space itself, and completely empty except for a mirror on the far wall. The light was coming from the mirror. It wasn't a normal mirror. The glass rippled, as though it were made of water, and the reflection didn't quite line up with reality. My reflection was there, but it didn't move the way I did. When I raised my hand, it raised its hand a fraction of a second later. When I tilted my head, it tilted in the opposite direction. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice trembling. My reflection smiled. I bolted. Scrambling back through the passage, I felt something brush against my leg. It wasn't rough like the walls. It was soft, almost silky. I didn't stop to see what it was. When I finally crawled out into my bedroom, I slammed the panel shut and shoved a dresser in front of it. I told myself I wouldn't go back. The next morning, I found a handprint on the mirror above my bathroom sink. It wasn't mine. The days that followed were a blur of unease. I kept seeing things out of the corner of my eye, shadows moving where they shouldn't, flashes of light coming from behind the dresser. At night, I'd hear faint sounds from the closet, tapping, like fingernails against wood, and the soft, rhythmic hum of something alive. I called the landlord, desperate for answers. He was unusually curt when I mentioned the panel. "Leave it alone," he said. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "It's old," he replied, avoiding the question. "Some things in that building should stay the way they are. Don't mess with it again." That night, I dreamed about the mirror. In the dream, I was standing in front of it, but my reflection wasn't copying my movements anymore. It was grinning, its teeth too sharp, too white. It pressed its hand against the glass, and the surface began to ripple. When I woke up, I was standing in front of my closet. The dresser moved aside. The panel was open. The passage was different this time. The walls seemed to pulse, contracting and expanding like lungs, and the light at the end was brighter, almost blinding. I told myself not to go in, but my feet moved on their own. The room was waiting for me. The mirror was larger now, stretching from floor to ceiling, and the reflection wasn't me anymore. It was something wearing my face. It stepped out of the mirror. I don't know how to describe what happened next. The thing walked toward me, its movements fluid and wrong, like it wasn't used to being solid. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. It reached out, and I felt its fingers graze my arm, cold, damp, and impossibly strong. When I woke up, I was in my bed. The panel was closed, the dresser back in place. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare. Then I saw the mirror. The reflection was smiling, and it wasn't me. No one ever looked twice at the map on the cafe wall. It hung there like a dusty artifact, a faded canvas of twisting rivers, nameless cities, and mountains drawn with dramatic, jagged lines. The details were exquisite but wrong. Entire regions curved unnaturally, roads looped endlessly, and the colors seemed off, muted yet too sharp where they shouldn't be. I only noticed it because of the storm. The rain had trapped me in that corner booth for hours, and the longer I stared at the map, the more I felt it staring back. It wasn't marked with any recognizable geography. No continents I could name, no oceans I knew. Yet the longer I studied it, the more familiar it felt, as though it were a place I'd once visited in a dream. When the waiter came to clear my empty coffee cup, I gestured toward it. "That's an unusual map. Where's it from?" His face froze for a split second before he recovered. "Oh, that thing? Been here forever. Nobody knows." He didn't meet my eyes as he gathered my plate and walked away quickly. I should have left it alone. I should have gone home once the rain let up. But something about that map lingered in my mind. By the time the storm passed, I'd memorized the sharp curve of its rivers, the strange symbols etched into its corners, the one road that spiraled inward like a snail shell. 2 nights later, I dreamed of it. In the dream, I was walking along one of the map's rivers, its surface as still as glass. The air was thick and cool, and the horizon stretched endlessly, the kind of vastness that made you feel small in a way the waking world never could. The road wound ahead of me, and I followed it without question. When I woke, I was standing barefoot in my kitchen, a faint trace of water on the floor as though I'd walked straight out of the river. I didn't go back to the cafe, not at first. I told myself it was just a dream, that it meant nothing, even as I caught myself sketching the map's contours on napkins, the edges of newspapers, even the fogged bathroom mirror after a shower. It was always there, lingering at the edges of my thoughts. By the end of the week, I couldn't resist any longer. The cafe was quieter than usual, the low hum of conversation replaced by an unnatural stillness. The waiter from before was gone, replaced by a new face that didn't seem to care as I walked straight to the map. Something was different. The map had changed. The river I dreamed of was now darker, almost black, and the spiraling road had shifted subtly, its curves more pronounced. But it wasn't the map's details that stopped me cold. It was the new marking, a tiny red that hadn't been there before. It pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat. I don't remember leaving the cafe. All I remember is standing in my apartment later that night. The lights off, the map burned into my vision. I couldn't shake the feeling that the dot was waiting for me, calling me. By the next morning, I'd made my decision. It took me 3 hours to find the road. I didn't expect it to be real, not truly, but when I rounded a bend on an unfamiliar stretch of highway, there it was. A narrow, unmarked path, its asphalt cracked and overgrown with weeds, curving into a forest so dense it seemed to swallow the sunlight. I hesitated only briefly before turning onto it. The air changed as soon as I entered. The forest was silent, unnaturally so, the kind of quiet that felt like a living thing. The road wound on, each curve tighter than the last, until I was certain I'd been driving for hours yet hadn't gone more than a few miles. Finally, the trees parted, revealing a clearing bathed in pale, gray light. At its center stood a small house, its wooden exterior weathered and sagging, as though it had been abandoned for decades. The red dot. I don't know how I knew, but this was it. The place on the map. I stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath my feet. The house loomed ahead, its windows dark, its door slightly ajar. Every instinct told me to turn back, to get in my car and drive until the forest was a distant memory. But the pull was stronger. Inside, the air was damp and cold, smelling of earth and something metallic. The floor creaked beneath me as I moved through the narrow hallway, the walls lined with faded photographs. They were all of me, images from every stage of my life, from childhood birthdays to moments I couldn't place. Sitting in a cafe I didn't recognize, standing on a pier I'd never visited. My breath quickened as I reached the last photograph, larger than the rest, framed in tarnished silver. It showed me standing in the clearing outside, staring at the house. Behind me, in the photograph's shadows, something moved. I turned, half expecting to see whatever it was. The door to the house slammed shut, and the world shifted. The forest outside was gone. The clearing was gone. I stood now in a vast, open landscape, the sky overhead swirling with colors that defied description. The road stretched out before me, impossibly long, leading toward a horizon that shimmered like heat waves. The map. I was inside the map. Something moved in the distance, a figure walking along the road. It stopped, turned, and raised a hand in a gesture that felt too familiar. It was me. The morning everything shifted. I woke to a faint smell of smoke. Not acrid, like something burning, but warm and comforting, like cedar catching fire in a hearth. My apartment was still, sunlight pooling on the hardwood floor in clean lines, but the air felt different, charged, like the pause before a thunderclap. At first, I thought it was the kind of unease that comes with a half-remembered dream. I tried to shake it off as I brewed my coffee and scrolled through the morning news, but something in the back of my mind stayed alert, like a sentry on the edge of a forest. Then I noticed the photograph. It wasn't there the night before. I was certain of that. It sat on my kitchen counter now, propped up between the sugar jar and the toaster, as though it belonged. The photo was small, square, like the kind you'd pull from an old Polaroid camera. It showed a field at sunset, golden light washing over a tree with branches spread wide and low. I didn't recognize the place, and yet, I did. The tree felt familiar, though I couldn't place it. My fingers brushed the edges of the photo, and for a moment, the air in the room felt heavy, the kind of pressure that makes your ears pop. It passed quickly, leaving me staring at the image, heart racing for reasons I couldn't name. I took the photo with me to work, slipping it into my bag without thinking. The day that followed was a blur of meetings and emails, the mundane rhythm of office life pulling me along. It wasn't until lunchtime, as I sat alone in the small park near my office, that the photo came back to me. When I pulled it out, it had changed. The tree was still there, but the sun was gone, replaced by a pale gray sky that seemed too flat, too uniform. A shadow stretched across the ground now, long and narrow, as though something just out of frame was watching. I stared at the photo, my appetite forgotten, and felt the air around me shift again. Subtle, but undeniable. The leaves on the trees nearby rustled softly, though there was no wind. A bird overhead froze mid-flight, wings outstretched, suspended in a moment that refused to move forward. Then everything snapped back. The bird flew on, the leaves settled, and the park returned to its quiet, ordinary self. But the photograph stayed different. By the time I got home, the shadow had grown. The gray sky in the image had darkened, and the shadow that had been a thin line was now broad and deep, spilling toward the base of the tree like spilled ink. I turned the photo over, half expecting to find writing or a mark, but the back was blank. That night, I dreamed of the tree. It stood in the middle of a vast plain, its branches stretching upward like arms in prayer. The sky above was too low, pressing down on the horizon like a lid, and the air hummed with an electric charge. I stood at the edge of the plain, hesitant to approach, and as I watched, the shadow appeared. Not from above, but from below, spreading outward like a pool of water, soaking into the earth. When I woke, the photo was on my nightstand. I hadn't put it there. The tree in the photo looked the same as in my dream, the shadow stretching across the field like an accusation. My chest felt tight, like I'd been running, though I hadn't moved all night. I threw the photo into a drawer and slammed it shut, telling myself it didn't matter. But things kept happening. Objects in my apartment started shifting, just enough to notice. My keys ended up on the windowsill instead of the counter. A book I hadn't opened in years sat on my coffee table with its spine cracked. Once, I woke to find my shoes in the bathroom, side by side as though waiting for me to step into them. And the photograph kept coming back, no matter where I put it. Hidden in drawers, shoved under the couch, thrown into the trash. It always reappeared, sitting patiently in plain sight. Each time I looked, the image was darker. The sky in the photo had turned almost black now, streaked with faint, branching lines that might have been lightning or cracks. The shadow had nearly consumed the tree, reaching its roots like claws. And then, one night, the photo changed completely. The tree was gone. The field in the photograph was empty now, a barren expanse under a starless sky. At the center of the image, where the tree had once stood, was a figure. It was impossible to make out the figure's face, but its posture was unmistakable. It was looking at me. I didn't sleep that night. The dream stopped after that, but the photograph didn't. The figure grew closer with each passing day, its form sharpening in the image until I could see details. A long coat, hands folded at its sides, a head tilted slightly, as though curious. By the end of the week, it had reached the edge of the photo, its hands pressed against the frame like it was trying to push through. That night, as I sat on my couch with every light in the apartment blazing, I heard the sound of footsteps. They weren't in the hallway outside my door. They were closer, soft, deliberate, moving across the floor of my living room. I didn't dare look up. When I finally did, the photograph was on the table in front of me. The figure was gone. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the empty field in the photo. The shadow was still there, faint but spreading, and I knew it wasn't finished with me. The tree, the field, the figure, whatever they were, whatever they wanted, they weren't bound by the photograph anymore. And now, neither am I. The first time I saw the man, he was standing at the corner of the street, staring at my house. I wouldn't have noticed him if not for the unnatural stillness. He didn't move, not even to shift his weight or glance at passing cars. His face was obscured by shadow, but I could tell he was looking at me, or rather, at the second-floor window where I stood. It was early evening, the kind of twilight that softens everything into half-real shapes, And for a moment I thought he might just be someone waiting for a ride or taking a break from a walk. Then he stepped forward, and the streetlight hit him. He was wearing a suit, an old-fashioned three-piece number that hung on him like it had been made for someone else. His skin was pale, almost gray, and stretched too tightly over his skull. His eyes were hidden behind round, wire-framed glasses, the lenses reflecting the last rays of sunlight. But it was his mouth that struck me. He was smiling, wide and toothy, as though he'd just heard the best joke in the world. I closed the curtain quickly, my heart thudding in my chest. When I peeked out again a few minutes later, he was gone. I tried to forget about it. People are weird sometimes, I told myself. Maybe he was lost or confused. But the unease lingered, a small, sharp thing gnawing at the edges of my mind. The next night, he was back. This time, he was standing closer, just beyond the edge of my driveway. The suit looked even more ill-fitting in the light of the street lamp, the fabric rumpled and frayed at the cuffs. His hands hung limply at his sides, and his smile seemed wider, sharper. I didn't stay at the window long enough to see what he would do. I turned off the lights, locked the doors, and went to bed with my phone clutched in one hand, though I didn't call anyone. What would I even say? The third night, I didn't look for him, but around midnight, I heard the knock. It was soft at first, so faint that I wasn't sure I'd heard anything at all. Then it came again, louder this time, deliberate and rhythmic. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 more. I crept to the window, careful to stay out of sight. When I pulled the curtain back just a fraction, he was standing on my porch. He didn't knock again. He just stood there, smiling, his head tilted ever so slightly to one side, as though waiting for me to come out and join him. My phone slipped out of my hand and hit the floor. The sound wasn't loud, but it was enough. His head snapped toward the window. For the first time, I could see his eyes clearly behind the glasses. They weren't right. The irises were too big, the pupils too small, like a predator's caught in the beam of a flashlight. His smile never wavered. I stumbled back from the window and spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner of my bedroom, clutching a kitchen knife and trying to convince myself I wasn't losing my mind. By the time morning came, he was gone. I called the police that day. They took my statement and sent a patrol car to drive through the neighborhood, but there wasn't much else they could do. Could just be a prank, the officer said, though his tone suggested he didn't really believe that. Call us if he comes back. He did come back. The next few nights were the same. The man on the street, then the driveway, then the porch. Always the same suit, the same smile, the same eyes that didn't blink. The knocks became more insistent, the rhythm more erratic. Sometimes they came from the front door, sometimes from the windows, sometimes, most disturbingly, from inside the walls. I stopped sleeping. I borrowed my neighbor's dog for a night, hoping its presence would deter him. But the dog wouldn't stop growling, its gaze fixed on the corners of the room where no one stood. By morning, it refused to come back inside. Then the letters started. They were slipped under the door, folded neatly and written in a looping, elegant script. Each one was addressed to me by name, and each one said the same thing. Let me in. I burned them without reading further. The man never spoke. Not when he knocked, not when he smiled at me through the glass, not when I shouted at him to leave. But one night, just before dawn, I woke to find him inside. He was standing at the foot of my bed, his head tilted, his glasses reflecting the faint glow of my alarm clock. His suit was wet, dripping onto the carpet, though I couldn't tell with what. The air around him smelled of damp earth and something metallic. I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. He leaned forward, his smile stretching impossibly wide, until his face was inches from mine. "Let me in," he whispered, the words curling around me like smoke. When I blinked, he was gone. I don't live in that house anymore. I don't live anywhere for long. The man still finds me. He doesn't need a street lamp or a porch to stand under. He doesn't knock anymore. I don't know what happens if I let him in, but some nights, when the knocking starts again, I think I might be close to finding out. The first letter arrived folded inside my electric bill. It was handwritten on yellowed stationery, the kind that smelled faintly of mildew and time. There was no signature, no return address, just 4 words scrawled in spindly ink: "You shouldn't be here." At first, I thought it was some prank, maybe a misdelivered note that had accidentally slipped into my envelope at the post office. It wasn't until I looked closer that I realized the paper was damp, the ink bleeding slightly at the edges. The bill, on the other hand, was perfectly dry. I checked my locks that night, twice. My apartment was on the third floor of an old brownstone, with a single entry door and windows that hadn't opened since the Reagan administration. Nobody could have gotten in. Nobody should have been able to. I almost convinced myself it was nothing until the second letter arrived. This one wasn't hidden. It sat in the center of my kitchen table, perfectly aligned with the edge, though I knew I hadn't put it there. I hadn't touched the table at all that day. "They're watching you now." My hands shook as I stared at the note. The handwriting was the same, thin and deliberate, like a needle threading words into paper. I checked the locks again, pulled the curtains closed, and left the TV on for noise. The landlord didn't answer when I called. Neither did my mother. I sat awake in the armchair until dawn, clutching the letter like a warning. For days, nothing else happened. The silence grew heavier, like the pause before an orchestra strikes the first note. I carried the letters in my pocket, rereading them so often the paper started to fray. I began to notice small things in my apartment that felt off. The shoes I left by the door would face the wrong direction. The bathroom mirror would fog, even though I hadn't used the shower. Once, I found a single strand of hair stretched across my pillow, too long, too dark to be mine. The third letter was different. It wasn't left for me to find. It was waiting when I opened the fridge. I don't know how long I stood there, the cold air curling around my feet as I stared at the paper tucked neatly between the milk and a carton of eggs. I should have been scared. I should have called someone. Instead, I unfolded it like I was reading a grocery list. "You've already let them in." That was when I started to notice the static. At first, it was just on the TV. A flicker here, a low hum there, easily explained by bad reception or an old set. But then it spread. My phone wouldn't hold a signal. My radio crackled with bursts of white noise, no matter the station. One night, I woke to find my clock blinking, not from a power outage but from something else, something that had rewound the time to exactly 12 o'clock. The static wasn't random, either. It followed a pattern, a rhythm, like a conversation I wasn't invited to hear. By the time the fourth letter came, I wasn't sleeping. It arrived inside a cereal box I'd bought that same morning, the plastic seal still unbroken. Stop looking for answers. I was unraveling. Every shadow became a threat, every creak in the floorboards a step too close. The letters piled up faster after that, appearing in impossible places. Folded into my coat pocket while I wore it, stuck to the underside of my desk, pressed between the pages of a book I hadn't opened in years. They started to repeat themselves, old warnings looping back with subtle changes. "You shouldn't be here" became "You're still here." Then, finally, "It's too late to leave." One night, I decided I couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. I packed a bag, threw the letters in the trash, and left, not caring where I went as long as it was far away. As I locked the door behind me, I felt the oddest sense of relief. Whatever this was, it would stay here. It wasn't mine to carry anymore. I made it 3 blocks before the buzzing started. At first, I thought it was a streetlight, that faint electrical hum you can almost ignore. But it grew louder, sharper, until I could feel it in my teeth. My bag felt heavier with every step, as if something was dragging me back. When I finally stopped and unzipped it, my stomach dropped. The letters were inside, every single one. But they weren't the same. The paper had turned black, the writing embossed in a silver that glinted under the street lamp. I reached for the nearest one, my hands trembling, and flipped it open. There's nowhere to run. The buzzing swelled, filling my head, my body, until it felt like my skull would split. I dropped the bag and ran. I don't know how far I got or how long I was gone before my legs gave out and I collapsed on a bench, gasping for air. The noise had stopped, replaced by a silence so profound it felt unnatural. I thought I was alone until I saw them. They stood at the edge of the park, shadows too tall to belong to the trees. There were 4 of them, their outlines faint and blurred, like smudges on an old photograph. As I watched, they moved closer, not walking but shifting, their forms rippling like heat haze. One of them raised a hand, or something that looked like a hand. I didn't wait to see what it wanted. I woke up in my apartment the next morning, my bag still on the floor by the door. The letters were gone. For a moment, I thought it might have all been a dream, some feverish nightmare brought on by too much stress and too little sleep. Then I saw the last note, propped neatly on my pillow. It wasn't handwritten this time. It was printed, the ink crisp and sharp, as if it had been made just for me. Welcome back. They'll come again. The house wasn't supposed to be there. It wasn't on the map, and it hadn't been in the listing. When I toured the rental property, a cozy bungalow on the edge of a quiet suburban street, the backyard had ended in a row of hedges. Beyond them, I'd assumed, was just more of the wooded buffer that separated the neighborhood from the freeway. It wasn't until I moved in and decided to explore that I noticed the gap in the hedges, a narrow path leading to the unexpected structure. The house was small, barely more than a shack, and it seemed to grow out of the forest as if it had been abandoned there long before the neighborhood was built. The wood siding was warped and weathered, patches of moss creeping up from the foundation. A single, cracked window stared blankly out at me like an unblinking eye. I should have turned back. Instead, I walked closer. There was a door, slightly ajar, its hinges rusted and sagging. The air smelled damp, metallic. My curiosity wrestled with a deep, gnawing unease as I stood there, the sound of my own breathing louder than the silence of the woods. Then, I saw it, a figure, standing just inside the doorway. I froze, every muscle in my body locking into place. The figure was blurry, indistinct, like a shadow caught between one moment and the next. But it was there, too tall, too narrow, and utterly still. My heart raced as I stumbled backward, the damp ground squelching underfoot. By the time I looked up again, the figure was gone. The doorway was empty, the shack as lifeless as the woods around it. I told myself it was a trick of the light, that my mind had conjured a shape out of shadows and fear. But when I turned to leave, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small wooden box, half buried in the dirt by my feet. It wasn't there when I'd arrived. I was certain of it. Against my better judgment, I picked it up. It was surprisingly heavy, the wood dark and smooth, polished as if it had been handled often. There was no latch or hinge, just a seamless lid that slid open with an unnerving ease. Inside, I found a single object, a key, old and iron, its surface worn smooth by time. I didn't take it with me. I placed the box back where I'd found it and hurried home, forcing myself not to look back. But that night, I dreamed of the shack. In the dream, I was standing at the doorway again, the key heavy in my hand. The figure was there too, clearer this time. It wasn't blurry, wasn't indistinct. It was looking at me. The dreams continued. Every night, I returned to the shack. And every night, the figure was waiting, its form solidifying, its presence growing heavier. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just watched, as though it was waiting for me to do something. By the end of the week, I couldn't stay away. I told myself I needed to confront whatever this was, to prove to myself that it was all in my head. Armed with nothing more than a flashlight and a pocket knife, I pushed through the hedges and followed the path to the shack. The box was gone. The doorway was open, a sliver of darkness cutting into the woods. My legs felt heavy, my breath shallow, but I stepped inside. The air was colder here, damp and stagnant, carrying a faint hum that vibrated through my chest. The walls were lined with shelves, and on each shelf was a collection of jars. They glinted faintly in the beam of my flashlight, their glass cloudy and thick. Inside, I could make out shapes, unidentifiable, writhing shapes that moved too slowly to be alive, but too deliberately to be anything else. My stomach turned as I backed away, nearly tripping over a warped floorboard. And then I heard it, a faint scratching sound, like nails against wood. It was coming from deeper inside the shack, from a narrow doorway I hadn't noticed before. The sound grew louder, more insistent, as though whatever was behind the door knew I was there. I should have left. I should have run, but something compelled me to step forward, to open the door. Behind it was a staircase, spiraling downward into a darkness that swallowed the beam of my flashlight. The scratching stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than sound, pressing against my ears and my chest. I didn't want to go down, but my legs moved on their own, carrying me deeper and deeper into the earth. The air grew colder, the hum louder, and the walls around me pulsed faintly, as though the shack itself was alive. At the bottom of the staircase, I found another room, smaller than the one above. It was empty, save for a single chair in the center and a figure sitting in it. Not the shadowy figure from before, but a man. Or at least, it looked like a man. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were closed. His hands rested on his knees, and in one of them, he held the iron key. I stood there, frozen, as the man's head tilted upward. His eyes opened, and they were dark, empty pits that seemed to stretch endlessly into nothingness. His mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but I could feel them. They vibrated through my chest, my skull, every nerve in my body screaming in protest. "Take it," he said, his voice a hollow echo that wasn't really a voice at all. I shook my head, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "Take it," he repeated, extending the key toward me. I don't remember running back up the stairs or bursting through the door of the shack. I don't remember how I got home, but the next morning, I found the key on my nightstand, its iron surface cold to the touch. I don't know what it unlocks, and I don't want to know, but every night, I hear the faint scratching sound again, coming not from the shack, but from the walls of my own home. It was the kind of small town that forgot you existed if you weren't careful. Nestled in a crook of the mountains, the place clung to its past like moss to stone. Faded signs for businesses long gone, telephone poles leaning under the weight of decades-old cables, and the faint, bitter scent of wood smoke always lingering in the air. I'd grown up there, though I'd done my best to forget. Life had pulled me away, but when the letter came from the lawyer's office, I found myself back on the winding road to claim the house I hadn't seen since my childhood. My great-uncle Lawrence had died, and somehow, out of the sparse handful of relatives who might have had a stronger claim, the place had landed in my lap. The house sat at the edge of the forest, the kind of place you only find if you already know it's there. I'd only been inside a few times as a child, and even then, the memories were fleeting. Dim rooms, high ceilings, a peculiar sense of cold that persisted even in the summer. Lawrence was the family's oddity, a man who never married and rarely left town. He'd been polite but distant, more an observer than a participant in the lives of others. His house was a reflection of him, solemn and sprawling, its black shutters peeled with age and its windows veiled by heavy curtains. The lawyer handed me the keys with little fanfare, save for an offhand remark as I signed the final papers. "Strange fellow, your uncle," he said, clicking his pen. "Never let anyone inside except for deliveries. Most of the town thought he had something to hide. You ever hear about that?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Lawrence had been a man of few words, but he'd often spoken in cryptic ones when I was younger. He'd once told me the house wasn't built for people, but for something else. At the time, I thought he meant ghosts or memories, but now, standing in front of the house as the key turned in the lock, I felt that vague, almost unnameable sense of foreboding he used to carry. The kind you only feel when you realize something is waiting for you. The interior smelled of age and solitude, an earthy scent mixed with the faint metallic tang of dust. The floors were wood, scarred from decades of use, and the furniture, what little there was, had been shrouded under white sheets. The kitchen was dated but functional, with avocado green cabinets and a fridge that groaned when I opened it. A single black envelope sat on the counter, addressed to me in a hand I recognized as Lawrence's. The ink had bled slightly into the thick paper, but the message inside was clear. The rules are simple. Keep the door locked, and don't look under the floor. It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. His handwriting had always carried a quiet urgency, as though he'd written it knowing he wouldn't have time to explain himself further. The door in question was easy to spot. It stood at the end of the hall, its frame darker than the rest of the wood, the paint glossy and unmarred. It had no handle, only a keyhole, and as I approached, I felt the faintest vibration in the floorboards beneath my feet. A hum, low and steady, as though the house was alive and breathing. I didn't try to open it. I didn't want to. Over the next few days, I busied myself with cleaning and sorting through Lawrence's belongings. The house was full of oddities. Jars of what looked like dried herbs labeled in a language I didn't recognize, bundles of twigs bound with red string, and notebooks filled with dense handwriting that seemed to spiral inward toward the center of the page. At night, I would hear faint noises, scraping, shuffling, the creak of floorboards. It was easy to blame the old pipes or the wind slipping through cracks in the walls, but the noises always seemed to come from the direction of the locked door. On the fifth night, the power went out. I lit candles and waited for the storm to pass, the house alive with the sound of rain hammering against the windows. The air felt heavier, the shadows deeper, and for the first time, I allowed myself to wonder if Lawrence's peculiarities had been more than eccentricities. As the hours stretched on, I found myself drawn to the door. Something in me wanted to look closer, to understand what it was hiding. I ran my fingers along the grain of the wood, feeling the faint hum I'd noticed before. The vibrations were stronger now, almost pulsing, like a heartbeat. I didn't open it, but when I pressed my ear against it, I thought I heard something on the other side. A sound too faint to name, but undeniably there. The next morning, I found scratch marks on the floor near the door, as though something had been trying to get out. They hadn't been there the night before. I was certain of it. I cleaned them up and tried to convince myself it had been a trick of the light or my own imagination. But the scratches reappeared the following night, deeper and more erratic. By the third night, they had spread halfway down the hall. I found another note on the seventh day, slipped under my bedroom door. It was written in the same hand as the first. They'll try to bargain with you. Don't listen. The words chilled me, not just because of their warning, but because they implied an inevitability I wasn't ready to face. That night, I dreamt of the door. In the dream, it wasn't locked. It stood open, the darkness beyond it rippling like water. Something stood inside. A figure too tall, too thin, its limbs bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Its voice was low and layered, each word brushing against my mind like a whisper and a scream all at once. It asked me to let it out. It promised me answers. I woke drenched in sweat, the house silent around me. When I stepped into the hall, I saw the door for what it was, not an entrance, but a boundary. The scratches on the floor had spread in looping patterns, almost deliberate, and the hum beneath my feet had turned into a thrum that resonated in my chest. The door was holding something back, and whatever it was getting stronger. The next few days passed in a haze. I avoided the hall entirely, sticking to the front rooms and sleeping on the couch, but the house wouldn't let me forget. The air seemed thicker, the noises louder. I found myself standing in front of the door without realizing how I'd gotten there. The key Lawrence had left on my dresser clutched in my hand. I would leave soon, I told myself. Pack a bag, abandon the house, and let someone else deal with its secrets. But I couldn't bring myself to walk away. On the 10th night, the door began to shake. It started as a faint rattle, then built into a violent shudder, the frame groaning under the pressure. I stood frozen in the hall, the key heavy in my hand, as the sound of splintering would fill the air. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the door fell silent. I never opened it. I didn't have to. Whatever was on the other side already knew my name. I don't know when it began. Maybe it had always been there, tucked into the folds of ordinary life, waiting for me to pay attention. The world doesn't scream when it slips, at least not at first. It whispers. It bends. And when you finally notice, it's already too late to look away. The first thing I couldn't ignore was the phone call. I was sitting on the couch one evening, half watching a documentary while scrolling on my phone. The ringing startled me, not because it was unexpected, but because the number calling was my own. I stared at the screen for a moment, frozen. My number. My name. The glow of the display seemed too bright, like the screen was daring me to answer. Without thinking, I swiped to accept. Hello? There was nothing at first, just the faint crackle of static, the kind you hear when a call is connected but no one speaks. Then, after what felt like an eternity, a voice that sounded almost like mine said, "Why are you still there?" The line went dead before I could respond. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept telling myself it was a prank or some glitch in the network, but my stomach wouldn't stop twisting. I tried calling the number back the next morning, but my phone didn't even attempt to connect. 2 days later, I noticed something else. The mailbox by my front door, which I rarely used, was open. A single piece of paper was folded neatly inside. No envelope, no stamp. Just one sentence scrawled across the page. Do not trust the reflections. I stared at the note for a long time, my mind cycling through possibilities. An elaborate joke, a neighbor with a strange sense of humor, a misplaced delivery. But the handwriting on the note was familiar. It was mine. I didn't throw it away. Instead, I placed it on my kitchen counter, where I could see it. I kept glancing at it as I went about my day, like it might somehow rewrite itself or explain its existence. By the time I noticed my reflection acting differently, I had already stopped feeling safe. It began as subtle movements, a blink that didn't quite match mine, the way my reflected hand seemed to hesitate a split second before following my real one. The worst part was the eyes. My reflection's gaze felt wrong, as though it was looking past me, searching for something just behind my shoulder. One night, I tested it. I sat in front of the bathroom mirror, my hands gripping the edges of the sink, and stared. The reflection stared back, its posture and expression identical to mine. I raised my right hand slowly, and the reflection did the same. Then, without moving my left hand, I watched as the reflection's left hand began to twitch. My stomach dropped. "Who are you?" I whispered. The reflection smiled. I wasn't smiling. I didn't return to the bathroom for the rest of the night. Things spiraled quickly after that. My shadow started showing up in places it shouldn't, on the ceiling while I lay in bed, on the opposite wall from where the light should have cast it. Once, I caught it moving when I was perfectly still. I began to feel like a trespasser in my own home. Objects would vanish and reappear in impossible places. A mug I'd left on the counter was suddenly balanced on top of the fridge. My shoes were tied together in a neat knot when I hadn't touched them. One morning, I found my front door unlocked, even though I clearly remembered locking it the night before. And then there was the corridor. It shouldn't have existed. My apartment wasn't large, just a modest one-bedroom with a simple layout. But one evening, as I walked toward the kitchen, I noticed a hallway that hadn't been there before. It was narrow, dimly lit, and stretched far longer than the dimensions of my apartment should have allowed. The air around it felt heavy, pressing against my skin like an invisible weight. At first, I thought I was imagining it. I closed my eyes, counted to 10, and looked again. The corridor was still there. I didn't walk down it right away. I stood at the threshold, my heart pounding in my chest, and listened. The space was utterly silent, but there was a faint sense of movement, like something was shifting just out of sight. I left the apartment that night, staying at a motel on the edge of town. I thought if I could just leave for a day, reset my mind, everything would go back to normal. But when I returned the next morning, the corridor was waiting. This time, I decided to step inside. The walls were unmarked, the floor bare, the light coming from nowhere I could identify. As I walked, the air seemed to thrum faintly, like the pulse of a distant machine. The farther I went, the more distorted the world behind me became. The hum of my refrigerator, the muffled sounds of traffic outside. Everything faded into a thick, oppressive quiet. I don't know how long I walked. It felt like hours, though the corridor never ended. Finally, I saw a door at the far end. It wasn't what I expected. The door wasn't ornate or menacing. It looked just like the one to my apartment. Same scuffs near the base, same slightly tarnished knob. I reached out, hesitating only for a moment, and opened it. I was back in my living room. At least, it looked like my living room. The furniture was in the right places, my books stacked neatly on the shelf. But there was something wrong with the light, as though it was filtering through an invisible lens, slightly warped and tinged with a faint green hue. And then I saw it. Me, sitting on the couch, reading a book. The other me looked up and smiled. "Finally," they said. I tried to back away, but the door was gone. My other self stood, stretching lazily, as though they'd been waiting for hours. "You took longer than I thought," they said. Their voice was calm, almost casual, but their eyes didn't match the tone. There was something hollow in them, something hungry. "What is this?" I whispered. They tilted their head, mimicking a movement I had made countless times. "You left the door open," they said simply, "and now it's my turn. I don't know how long I've been here now. The apartment looks the same, but the windows show nothing but an endless expanse of fog. The mirrors are gone, replaced by blank sheets of glass that reflect nothing. And sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint hum of that corridor, waiting just beyond the walls." The first thing I noticed was the radio. It wasn't even my radio. I don't own one. It was coming from the apartment next door, muffled through the thin walls, a scratchy old broadcast playing faintly as I folded laundry. At first, it was just static and the occasional burst of what might have been music, distorted like it was traveling from too far away. Then I heard the voice. "You've been dreaming again, haven't you?" The question was so direct that I froze mid-fold, the shirt dangling from my hands. The voice had a strange rhythm to it, like it wasn't entirely sure where the words belonged. "You thought it wasn't real. You were wrong." I waited for the laugh track or the ad jingle, anything that would anchor the sound to a reality I understood. But nothing came, just the crackle of static growing louder. I knocked on the wall, feeling silly but needing some kind of response, some proof that I wasn't hearing things. The radio went silent. For the next few days, life seemed normal, or close enough. Work was uneventful, my plants didn't mysteriously die, and the lights stayed on when I flipped the switch. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Then, Friday morning, the photo on my desk changed. It was an old shot of me at the beach, taken years ago. I wasn't smiling, just standing in front of the water, wind in my hair, the horizon stretching behind me. Except now, in the photo, the horizon was gone. The ocean had been replaced with something vast and black, a flat expanse of shadow that made the rest of the image feel paper-thin. My figure looked the same, but the wind wasn't tugging at my hair anymore. I was still, too still. I turned the photo face down and told myself it was some weird lighting issue or a printing defect. The air felt heavier after that, like I was moving through a world made of molasses. On the subway, I caught people watching me too long, their gazes lingering just past the point of politeness. At the grocery store, the cashier handed me my change and said, "You shouldn't be here." She smiled like it was a joke, but her hand trembled when she gave me the receipt. Back home, I found a scrap of paper wedged under my door. I assumed it was junk mail until I flipped it over. There's a crack in the floor. My stomach twisted. I scanned the hallway, but it was empty. When I went inside, I checked every inch of the apartment. The floorboards were solid, the tiles unbroken. It was just a note, a meaningless, cryptic note. That night, I woke up to the sound of scratching. It came from beneath the bed, a rhythmic scrape like claws dragging over wood. My heart thudded, each beat louder than the last. I told myself it was a mouse, or maybe something shifting in the pipes, but the sound didn't stop. Slowly, I leaned over the edge of the bed. The floor beneath it wasn't wood anymore. The space under the bed stretched impossibly deep, the boards swallowed by darkness that rippled faintly, like water catching the light. The scratching wasn't claws at all. It was the edge of the floor breaking apart, the pieces crumbling into the black below. I pulled back, heart hammering, and stayed curled on the mattress until dawn. The next morning, the floor was whole again. For weeks, the world played tricks on me. The photo on my desk disappeared entirely. The air in my apartment smelled faintly of metal, no matter how many candles I lit. My reflection began blinking at the wrong times. Not late, but too early, like it was tired of waiting for me to catch up. Once, as I was brushing my teeth, it spoke. "You're unraveling," it said, its mouth full of toothpaste foam. I didn't respond. I didn't trust my voice to stay steady. After that, I started finding doors. They appeared in places where no doors had been before. One at the end of the hallway in my building, another in the corner of a coffee shop I visited every morning. The first one was painted a deep red and had no handle. When I approached it, my pulse quickened, a sharp, instinctive dread curling in my chest. I touched it anyway. The surface was warm. It vibrated faintly, like something on the other side was alive and waiting. "Don't," The voice came from behind me. I spun around to see a man in a gray coat standing at the end of the hallway, his face obscured by shadow. He didn't move closer. He didn't need to. "You don't want to know what's on the other side," he said. I didn't argue. I backed away from the door and left the building without looking back. The doors kept appearing after that. Green ones, black ones, some that shimmered like they were made of glass. I never opened any of them. I didn't need to. Each one felt like it was waiting for me to fail. Last night, the scratching came back. This time, it wasn't under the bed. It was in the walls, the sound echoing through the apartment like something burrowing closer. I stayed up all night, pacing. At some point, I glanced out the window and saw the man in the gray coat standing on the sidewalk below, looking up at me. This morning, I found another note. It was folded neatly on my kitchen counter, though I hadn't touched the counter in days. "The crack isn't in the floor. It's in you." The scratching hasn't stopped. The walls feel thinner now, like they're straining to hold something back. And the worst part? The doors aren't waiting for me anymore. They're moving. The night was a patchwork of chaos, alive with the distant howl of wind and the faint creak of unseen branches. The house at the end of Ravenshaw Lane didn't feel haunted in the way movies often exaggerated. It was worse. It was indifferent. The walls didn't whisper secrets or scream in the dark. They simply existed, massive and quiet, as though swallowing sound itself. That was what drew me in. I wasn't supposed to be there. It wasn't even a dare. I wish it had been. There's something cleaner about the recklessness of a challenge, but curiosity, when left unchecked, becomes a sickness. My sickness started 3 weeks earlier when I saw the obituary. Evelyn Lark, 36, found deceased in her home. No foul play suspected. The photo attached to the notice didn't scream tragedy. It whispered it. Her smile was the kind that came from people who tried too hard to prove their happiness to everyone, including themselves. The house was hers. Abandoned now, its windows stared at the world like blind eyes, hollow and clouded. Most of the town wanted to forget Evelyn Lark's existence. Me? I couldn't. It wasn't just her death that bothered me. It was the after. The way the house seemed to soak up her absence and let nothing escape. Even now, standing before it, I felt that pull, a gravity not entirely my own. I climbed the rotting steps and pushed the door open. No locks. No resistance. It swung inward as though it had been waiting. The air inside was heavier than outside, saturated with something I couldn't name. Not dampness, not rot. It felt like silence itself had a weight here, pressing against my chest. The furniture was untouched. A layer of fine dust coated the surfaces, but nothing was disturbed. A life abandoned mid-breath. The first room I entered was the living room. Evelyn's sofa sat at an odd angle, as though someone had pushed it in haste but decided against moving it further. An empty teacup rested on the coffee table, its delicate rim cracked as though dropped. On the wall hung a single picture, a hand-painted landscape of a meadow with a house in the distance. The detail was stunning, the kind of work that pulls you in, makes you feel the wind in the painted grass. But the meadow was wrong. I could swear, as I stepped closer, the grass was shifting. Not in a breeze, but something slower, deliberate, as though the painting itself was alive. I blinked, and it was still. I turned my attention to the staircase. Evelyn had died upstairs, in her bedroom. That much I knew. I placed my foot on the first step, and it groaned beneath me, a sound almost human in its protest. The farther I climbed, the darker it became. The house seemed to pull light inward, swallowing it. At the top, the hallway stretched longer than it should have. 5 doors, all closed, all identical. Her bedroom was at the end. I reminded myself, the last door. But something whispered, no, nudged me toward the second door on the left. I felt it before I thought it. The door opened with surprising ease. It was a small room, almost a closet, with no furniture. Only a single mirror leaned against the far wall. Its surface was tarnished, the silver backing eaten away in patches. Yet I could see my reflection perfectly. Too perfectly. My reflection didn't move with me. It stayed still, staring back at me with wide, unblinking eyes. My chest tightened as the reflection tilted its head, just slightly, just enough to make my stomach lurch. My legs refused to obey the panic flooding my mind, and I watched helplessly as the figure in the mirror took a step closer, not toward the mirror's edge, but toward me. The door slammed behind me, breaking the spell. My body obeyed now, and I bolted, careening into the hallway and slamming into the opposite wall. I didn't look back. I wouldn't. The last door, Evelyn's door. It was closed, but not entirely. A sliver of darkness peeked out through the gap, the kind of darkness that felt alive. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The room was empty. Her bed was neatly made, untouched. A faint breeze brushed past me, though the windows were shut. I stepped inside, the floor creaking beneath me, and that's when I saw it, the writing. It was carved into the walls, the furniture, even the ceiling. Words in a language I didn't recognize, jagged and looping, like scars that had grown over time. They pulsed faintly, as though something beneath the surface of the house was alive and breathing. On the bed lay a single object, a locket. I didn't want to touch it, but I couldn't stop myself. My fingers closed around the cool metal, and the room seemed to shift. The walls stretched, the writing twisting into new shapes. The air grew colder, and the faint sound of breathing, mine, I thought at first, filled the space. But it wasn't mine. I opened the locket. Inside was a photograph, but not of Evelyn. It was me. Not me as I was now, but me as I'd been 5 years ago, smiling at a beach I hadn't visited in over a decade. My stomach turned to lead, and the sound of breathing grew louder. I turned toward the door, but it was gone. The room was gone. I stood in a meadow now, the one from the painting downstairs. The grass rippled, and in the distance, the house loomed, its windows glowing faintly. Behind me, a voice whispered, low and trembling with barely restrained emotion, "You shouldn't have come." I turned, and Evelyn stood there, her eyes sunken and her hands trembling. But her mouth was wrong, stretched too wide, a grotesque smile that didn't reach her eyes. Before I could speak, the grass began to writhe, twisting upward like serpents, curling around my legs and pulling me down. Evelyn didn't move to stop it. She just watched, her smile widening as the world dissolved into darkness. When I woke up, I was back in my car, parked at the end of Ravenshore Lane. The house was gone, replaced by an empty field. But the locket sat in my lap, and I knew, deep down, that I hadn't left anything behind. Something had followed me. The first sound wasn't unusual. A knock at the front door, sharp and deliberate, in the middle of the evening. But it was the pattern that stopped me mid-step. 3 knocks, a pause, then 2, a pause, then 3 more. A rhythm too precise to be casual. I hesitated, the half-full glass of water in my hand tipping slightly, sending a cold trickle over my knuckles. I lived alone, and I wasn't expecting anyone. My neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where unexpected visitors usually came with a "sorry to bother you" smile and an immediate explanation. This knock had none of that warmth. It felt rehearsed. I set the glass down on the counter and approached the door, my bare feet silent on the hardwood. Through the peephole, I saw no one. The porch was empty. I stared longer than I should have, straining to catch movement in the shadows of the yard. But the world outside was unnervingly still. I opened the door just enough to peek out, the cool evening air brushing against my face. Nothing. Not a single footprint in the gravel walkway, not even the faintest sound of retreating footsteps. Just a small package, square and wrapped in brown paper, resting on the welcome mat. It had no markings, no postage. I crouched to inspect it, wary of touching it at first. As I leaned closer, I noticed faint writing pressed into the paper, not written in ink but embossed so subtly that it was only visible in the slanting light of the porch bulb. The words were strange, "For when you forget." Forget what? I brought the package inside, curiosity quickly overtaking caution. It was light, almost hollow feeling, and the paper smelled faintly of something herbal, like rosemary or sage. I debated calling someone, a friend, the police even, but the situation felt too strange to explain. What could I say? Someone left a weird, cryptic gift on my porch, and it's unsettling? Instead, I carefully unwrapped it. Beneath the paper was a small wooden box, its surface polished smooth but unadorned. The lid slid off easily, revealing a single item inside, a pocket watch. It wasn't ornate, just a simple, tarnished silver piece with a plain face and an inscription etched around the edge. The words were in a language I didn't recognize, the letters looping and angular, almost alive in their intricacy. I held it up to the light, the chain dangling, and as I did, the watch face shifted. At first, I thought it was a reflection of the bulb overhead, but then I realized the hands weren't marking time. They were spinning backward, faster and faster, until they blurred into nothing. And then they stopped. The room felt different. Not colder or darker, just wrong. I glanced around and noticed subtle changes. The water glass I'd left on the counter was gone. The coat I draped over the back of a chair was neatly hung on the rack by the door. My phone, which had been charging on the kitchen counter, was now on the coffee table in the living room, glowing faintly with a notification I didn't remember receiving. I looked back at the watch. Its hands were still. The chain was warm in my palm, like it had been lying in the sun. A noise behind me made me jump, a clatter of silverware. I spun around to see the drawer under the counter halfway open, a single spoon resting on the floor. My heart pounded as I bent to pick it up, trying to steady my breathing. And then the knock came again. 3 knocks. Pause. 2 knocks. Pause. 3. I froze, clutching the spoon like a weapon. The sound was exactly the same as before, the same deliberate rhythm. Slowly, I made my way back to the door, my footsteps hesitant, my pulse racing. When I looked through the peephole, I expected to see emptiness again, but this time, there was someone there. A man, dressed in a dark coat, stood on the porch. His head was tilted slightly, as though listening for something, and his face was shadowed by the brim of a hat. He held his hands clasped in front of him, still as a statue. I didn't open the door. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice shaky. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a second package, identical to the one I had just unwrapped. He set it on the welcome mat, turned, and walked away, his footsteps utterly silent. I waited until he was out of sight before opening the door again. The new package was exactly like the first, down to the faint herbal smell and embossed words on the paper. This time, the inscription read, "For when you lose." Inside was another pocket watch. The hands on this one weren't moving backward. They were stuck, trembling faintly, as though struggling to tick forward but unable to. I placed it next to the first one on the counter, the 2 watches sitting side by side like twin relics of a time I didn't remember. I didn't sleep that night. The house felt alive, every creak of the floorboards or whisper of the wind outside drawing my attention. I checked the locks repeatedly, paced the living room until my feet ached, and kept glancing at the 2 watches, expecting them to do something. At some point, exhaustion won out, and I fell asleep on the couch. When I woke up, the first watch was gone. In its place was a slip of paper, folded neatly in half. Written on it, in the same looping, unfamiliar script, was a single line. "It's already begun." I stared at the note, my mind racing. The room felt smaller, the walls closer. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, and when I checked the screen, the notification read, 3 days remaining. 3 days until what? I didn't have an answer, but somewhere deep inside, I knew the watches weren't finished with me. The call came at 9:37 p.m. I remember the exact time because I just sat down with a beer and a basket of laundry, ready to settle into the mindless rhythm of folding socks. The number was unknown, but not one of those random strings you'd dismiss as spam. It had a local area code. I hesitated, then answered. "Hello?" I said. At first, there was nothing, just a faint crackle of static, like the old radio my dad kept in the garage. Then, a voice, low and deliberate, said, "Your name is on the list." I blinked. "Excuse me? What list?" The line went dead. I stared at my phone for a long moment, unsure if I'd just been pranked, or if this was some new telemarketing tactic designed to get under your skin. I laughed it off, but the sound came out thin, uncertain. The beer tasted bitter, and the laundry suddenly felt like too much effort. I turned off the lights and went to bed. That night, I dreamed of a room I didn't recognize. It was dark, but not empty. There were rows of shelves stretching into the distance, each one crammed with boxes, papers, and odd little trinkets. The air smelled metallic, like rain on rust. At the far end of the room was a desk, and behind it, a figure. I couldn't make out details, just the vague impression of a person, their face obscured by shadows. They were writing something. With each stroke of the pen, the sound echoed like nails on glass. I tried to move closer, to see what they were writing, but the room stretched further away the more I walked. When I finally got close enough to see the page, I realized it was my name, written over and over in a tight, looping script. I woke up gasping, heart hammering. The clock on my nightstand read 3:12 a.m. My phone buzzed. Another unknown number. I didn't answer. The next morning, I convinced myself it had all been a weird coincidence. Sleep deprivation, maybe. Too much caffeine. But then the note started. The first one was tucked under the windshield wiper of my car. It was written on plain white paper in the same neat, looping handwriting from the dream. Your name is on the list. You are next. I stared at it for a long time, my breath fogging up the morning air. When I finally peeled it off, my fingers trembled. The words weren't menacing, exactly. They were matter of fact, like the kind of note someone would leave to remind you about a dentist appointment. That made it worse somehow. I stuffed the note into my pocket and drove to work, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was just paranoia, but that day, I couldn't focus. I jumped at every sudden sound, caught myself glancing over my shoulder at nothing. When I got home, there was another note waiting for me, slipped under my front door. The list cannot be changed. I didn't sleep that night. The following days were a blur of unease and unanswered questions. The notes kept coming, appearing in places that shouldn't have been accessible. Inside my locked apartment, on my pillow, even tucked into my wallet. Each one was simple, direct, but always the same theme. The list. I tried throwing them away, but they always reappeared. Sometimes they'd multiply, scattered across my kitchen counter like confetti. Once, I found one taped to my bathroom mirror. Written on it was, "It's almost time." I decided to do some digging. I called the local police, but they dismissed me as paranoid. When I mentioned the notes, the officer on the other end chuckled. "Sounds like you've got an overzealous pen pal," he said. "Try changing your locks." Desperate, I turned to the internet. I scoured forums, conspiracy blogs, even the deepest recesses of message boards dedicated to urban legends. Eventually, I found a thread buried in an obscure corner of the web. The title was simple: "Has anyone else been put on the list?" The post was from a user named Counting Down, who described something eerily similar to what I was experiencing. Calls, notes, and an overwhelming sense of being followed. The replies were a mix of curiosity and skepticism. One caught my attention. "The list is not a warning. It's a contract." I messaged the poster, asking what they meant. The reply came quickly: "You can't stop it, but you can prepare." I didn't know what that meant, and they didn't respond again. The turning point came 3 days later. I was lying in bed, trying to drown out the gnawing fear with background noise from the TV, when the screen flickered and went black. The air in the room felt heavy, like the pressure before a storm. My phone buzzed. This time, the text was from my own number. "Go to the park." I don't know why I listened. Maybe I was too scared to disobey. Maybe I needed to know what was happening. I threw on a jacket and drove to the park. It was deserted, the playground equipment gleaming under the pale light of the street lamps. As I stepped out of the car, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was the same one from my dream, the figure behind the desk. Up close, they were impossibly tall, their features blurred as though smeared by an unseen hand. They extended a hand, and in their palm was a list. My name was at the top. "What is this?" I whispered, my voice shaking. The figure tilted its head, almost curious. Then, for the first time, it spoke. "The list is balance. It is order. One name must always come next." "What happens if I'm next?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it placed the list on the ground and vanished into the darkness. I stared at the paper, my hands trembling as I picked it up. Beneath my name, in fresh, looping script, was another name. Someone I didn't recognize. I'm writing this now because I think I understand. The list doesn't end. Someone has to carry it, pass it forward. And if they don't, well, I don't want to find out what happens. I haven't decided what to do yet, but the list is sitting in front of me, and the pen is in my hand. The first time I saw her, she was walking against the flow of the crowd. It was rush hour at the subway station, and commuters were surging forward like a river breaking free from its banks. But she moved differently, not rushing, not weaving, just walking slowly, methodically, against the tide. What caught my attention wasn't her pace, but the umbrella she carried. It was a dull red, its fabric torn in several places, though the sky outside had been clear all day. She didn't hold it open. She simply gripped the handle tightly, as though it were the only thing anchoring her to the world. For a moment, she seemed to glance in my direction, her face framed by uneven bangs that hung just above her sharp, dark eyes. Something about her gaze sent a chill down my spine. Not fear exactly, but a sense of recognition I couldn't place. Before I could process it, she was gone, swallowed by the crowd. I didn't think much of it at the time. Strange people exist in every city, and the subway is their natural habitat. Still, the red umbrella stuck in my mind like a splinter. The second time I saw her, it was raining. Not a drizzle, but one of those sudden, violent storms that makes the air feel electric. I was on my lunch break, standing under the awning of a deli and watching the downpour hammer the sidewalk. And there she was, across the street, walking at the same deliberate pace as before, her red umbrella open now, though it barely functioned with all the holes in the fabric. I couldn't help but stare. The storm made everyone else scatter like startled birds, darting into doorways or fumbling with their own umbrellas. But not her. She walked steadily, as if the rain wasn't touching her, as if it had nothing to do with her at all. When I looked away for just a moment to grab my phone, she vanished again. That night, I dreamed about the umbrella. In the dream, it wasn't just torn. It was bleeding. Thick, dark drops seeped from its edges, staining the pavement as she walked. I woke up with the taste of rust in my mouth and a heavy feeling in my chest, as though I'd run a marathon in my sleep. Over the next week, I started noticing her more often. At first, it felt random. A glimpse of her walking past a cafe window or standing at the edge of a crosswalk. Then the encounters became harder to ignore. I saw her outside my office, staring up at the building as if studying it. Another time, I caught sight of her through the window of a laundromat near my apartment, though I'd never seen her carrying anything that needed washing. She never looked directly at me again, but somehow, I felt watched, like I'd been pulled into her orbit without consent. It wasn't until the package arrived that I realized I might be in real danger. It was sitting on my doorstep one evening when I came home from work, a small, nondescript cardboard box with no return address. Inside was a red umbrella. Not her umbrella, exactly. It was new, pristine, with no tears or stains, but it was the same shade of red, bright, unnerving, impossible to ignore. There was no note, no explanation, just the umbrella. I didn't touch it. I couldn't. I left it on the floor of my hallway, like an uninvited guest I didn't dare confront. That night, I locked every door and window, drew the blinds, and slept with the lights on. Or tried to. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the apartment building, every distant sound from the street below, made my skin crawl. At 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of water dripping. At first, I thought it was the bathroom sink, but when I stepped into the hallway, my feet splashed into a shallow puddle. The umbrella was soaked. Water pooled around it, though the floor and walls were dry, and there was no sign of a leak. As I stared at the impossible scene, I felt a shift in the air behind me, a subtle disturbance like a held breath. I turned sharply, and there she was, standing in my living room, the torn umbrella gripped tightly in her hand. Her presence sucked the warmth from the room, leaving the air heavy and cold. She didn't move, didn't speak, but her eyes burned into mine with a weight that made my legs tremble. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of dripping water. Her gaze dropped to the new umbrella on the floor. For a moment, I thought she might speak. Instead, she turned and walked toward the door. It opened without her touching it, and she disappeared into the night, leaving behind nothing but the puddle and a suffocating silence. The next morning, the red umbrella was gone. I'd like to say that was the end of it, but it wasn't. The sightings continued, more frequent now, and more unnerving. She didn't always carry the umbrella. Sometimes, she was empty-handed, her pale fingers twitching slightly at her sides as if searching for something to hold. Other times, she stood in the shadows just outside the reach of the streetlights, her silhouette barely distinguishable from the darkness around her. The worst part was the feeling she left behind. It was more than fear. It was the sense that I was being rewritten, that every encounter was erasing pieces of me, replacing them with fragments of her. Memories began to shift and blur. I started dreaming in flashes of red and the sound of rain, even on clear nights. Sometimes, I'd wake up with wet footprints leading from my bed to the front door, though I hadn't left the apartment. I tried to tell someone, a friend, the police, but the words felt wrong as soon as I spoke them. They didn't fit, like trying to explain the logic of a dream. The officers were kind but dismissive, and my friend suggested I might need a vacation. "You've been working too hard," she said. "Maybe it's stress, but I know better. Stress doesn't leave footprints. Stress doesn't leave you feeling like you're dissolving." Last night, I found a new umbrella on my doorstep. This one wasn't red. It was black, its fabric sleek and untouched, the kind of umbrella you'd buy for a funeral. Inside was a note written in sharp, angular handwriting that wasn't mine but felt familiar. "It's your turn. I don't know what she wants. I don't even know if she's real. But the rain hasn't stopped since. And every time I close my eyes, I hear the faint sound of dripping water, growing louder, closer." It wasn't something I could pinpoint at first, more like a persistent feeling, the kind that drifts into your mind when you walk into a room and forget why you're there. A wrongness in the air, so faint it was easy to ignore. I'd been in my new apartment for a few weeks and blamed it on the adjustment. New places always feel foreign until you make them yours. The apartment itself was nothing special. A third-floor walk-up in a beige building that looked identical to every other one on the street. The landlord had told me the previous tenant moved out abruptly, leaving behind some furniture, which she generously offered to include in the lease. A couch, a rickety dining table, and a mirror hung in the hallway that she claimed was original to the place. It was the mirror that bothered me the most. It wasn't ugly, not really, but there was something off about it. The glass was too smooth, almost oily, and the heavy brass frame seemed out of place in an apartment as plain as this one. I hadn't noticed it during the walkthrough, but once I moved in, I couldn't stop looking at it. It hung directly across from the bathroom door, positioned so that every time I brushed my teeth or walked to the kitchen, I caught a glimpse of my own reflection. At first, I thought the discomfort was just vanity. Nobody likes to see themselves all the time. But after a few days, I started catching glimpses of something else. It always happened out of the corner of my eye. A shape in the mirror that didn't match the rest of the room. A shadow, maybe, or a faint distortion in the glass. Whenever I turned to face it directly, it was gone. Just my reflection staring back at me, looking as tired as I felt. I told myself it was nothing. The apartment was old, and old places come with quirks. Shifting shadows, drafts that made the curtains sway. Then I began hearing the whispers. They weren't words, not exactly, just a faint murmuring that came from somewhere deep in the apartment. They were easiest to hear at night, when the world outside was quiet. Lying in bed, I'd strain my ears and try to locate the source, but it always seemed to be moving, sliding just out of reach like a fish in dark water. I checked for everything, air ducts, pipes, even the neighbors, but nothing explained the whispers, and they grew louder with each passing night. The first time I saw the reflection move, it didn't register right away. I'd just come out of the shower, towel wrapped around me, and as I passed the mirror, I noticed it, the faintest flicker of motion in the glass. It wasn't me. I froze, my skin prickling, and turned to look directly at the mirror. My reflection stood there, damp hair clinging to my neck, an expression of mild confusion on its face. For a moment, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Light plays tricks, and mirrors aren't perfect. But as I started to turn away, I caught it again. Just a fraction of a second, but enough. My reflection's head tilted slightly, independently of my own. I didn't sleep that night. I threw a blanket over the mirror the next day. It helped, a little, though I still couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, though I couldn't make out the words. Sometimes, I swore I could feel a breeze on the back of my neck, as if someone were standing just behind me. And then the mirror started bleeding. It wasn't blood, not really. More like a thick, black liquid that oozed from the edges of the frame and dripped onto the floor. It smelled faintly of rust and seawater. When I touched it, my fingers came away clean. But the floor beneath the mirror stayed slick and wet, no matter how many times I wiped it down. I called the landlord, desperate for an explanation, but she just laughed it off. "Old places have their quirks," she said. "You'll get used to it." I didn't. The whispers became voices, clear enough now to understand fragments of sentences. They weren't speaking to me, but to each other. Their words sharp and clipped, as though arguing. Sometimes they laughed, a wet, guttural sound that made my stomach turn. One night, as I lay in bed with the blanket pulled over my head, I heard them say my name. The next morning, the blanket was gone. The mirror stood uncovered, and my reflection smiled at me. I didn't. It was a smile I didn't recognize, wide and toothy, with a faint glint of malice behind it. My stomach dropped as I realized my lips hadn't moved at all. I packed my things that day, left the furniture, the dishes, everything. I didn't care. I just wanted out. I moved in with a friend, crashing on their couch while I figured out my next steps. I didn't tell them what had happened. How do you explain something like that without sounding insane? But the mirror wasn't done with me. Last night, as I walked to the bathroom in my friend's apartment, I saw it, hanging on the wall at the end of the hallway, impossibly out of place. The brass frame gleamed in the dim light, and when I looked into the glass, my reflection was already waiting for me. This time, it waved. For as long as I can remember, I've had this strange habit. Whenever I move into a new apartment, I knock on the walls. Not loudly, not like I'm trying to annoy the neighbors, just a soft series of taps in various spots. It's not something I think much about. It's more instinct than ritual. Maybe I like the reassurance that the walls are solid, that there's no hidden hollow where something might be lurking. Or maybe I just like the sound of the noise bouncing back, proof that I'm alone. When I moved into this place last month, I did the same thing. I knocked on the walls of the living room, the bathroom, and the bedroom, feeling vaguely silly as I did. It was a quiet building, tucked into a sleepy part of town. The landlord had been friendly, the neighbors polite but distant. Everything about it seemed fine, perfect, even, until I knocked on the wall behind my bed. The sound that came back wasn't the dull, reassuring thud I was used to. It was sharp, almost hollow, like tapping on an old piece of furniture. I paused, my knuckles hovering over the painted drywall. Maybe there was a vent behind it, or a space for pipes. I knocked again, harder this time. The sound was the same. Hollow. Off. I should have let it go. It was probably nothing, but something about it tugged at me. A curiosity that felt closer to compulsion. I stepped back and stared at the wall, trying to imagine what might be behind it. The rest of the apartment didn't have any weird quirks. No creaking floorboards, no stuck windows. But that sound was different, unnatural. Later that night, as I lay in bed staring up at the ceiling, I heard something. A faint, rhythmic tapping, just soft enough to make me wonder if I was imagining it. At first, I thought it was my upstairs neighbor. Then I realized the sound wasn't coming from above me. It was coming from the wall. The same wall I'd knocked on earlier. I sat up, my heart pounding. The tapping stopped immediately, like whoever, or whatever, was on the other side had been waiting for me to notice. The silence that followed was so heavy I could feel it pressing on my chest. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe an old pipe expanding or a rodent scratching at the drywall. I grabbed my phone, opened a random podcast, and let the soothing voices drown out my fear until I fell asleep. The next morning, I inspected the wall more closely. It looked like any other wall. Smooth, painted off-white, utterly unremarkable. But when I pressed my ear to it, I thought I could hear something faint, like a low hum just beneath the surface. I spent the better part of an hour convincing myself it was just my imagination. But later that night, as I lay in bed, the tapping came again. This time, it was louder. It started softly, like before, then grew more insistent. 4 taps in quick succession, followed by a pause. Then again. 4 taps, pause. 4 taps, pause. The pattern was deliberate, rhythmic, like someone was trying to send a message. I didn't dare knock back. Instead, I lay there, paralyzed, staring at the wall as the tapping continued for what felt like hours. By the third night, I was exhausted. I'd barely slept, and the tapping had become more frequent, more erratic. It wasn't just at night anymore. I'd hear it in the middle of the day, while I was making coffee or folding laundry. Always the same wall, always the same hollow sound. I decided to investigate. Armed with a hammer and a flashlight, I stood in front of the wall, feeling ridiculous but too on edge to care. If there was some kind of animal trapped inside, I'd deal with it. If it was just a structural quirk, I'd laugh at myself later. Either way, I needed to know. I chose a spot just above the bed, where the tapping seemed loudest. I swung the hammer lightly at first, chipping away the paint and drywall. It was harder work than I expected, the material crumbling in uneven chunks. Eventually, I broke through, creating a small hole just big enough to peek inside. I expected to see insulation or pipes, maybe even a dead bird or a nest. Instead, I saw a void. The flashlight beam didn't hit anything, just blackness, stretching far beyond the boundaries of my apartment. The air that wafted out was cold and damp, carrying a faint, metallic tang. It didn't feel right. The space behind the wall was too deep, too vast to make sense. Then I heard it, breathing, slow, shallow, deliberate. It came from somewhere within the darkness, soft at first, then louder, closer. My hands shook as I leaned in, shining the flashlight into the void, desperate to see what was making the sound. That's when I saw the eyes. 2 pinpoints of light reflecting back at me, low to the ground. They blinked once, then twice, and began to rise, like whatever they belonged to was standing up. I stumbled backward, the flashlight slipping from my hands and clattering to the floor. The breathing grew louder, almost a growl now, reverberating through the wall. I ran. I didn't bother to lock the door or grab my shoes. I just ran down the hallway, out of the building, and into the street. My neighbors' windows were dark, the entire block eerily silent. I spent the night in my car, parked a few blocks away, my hands still trembling as the sun rose. I haven't been back to the apartment since. The landlord called me after a few days, annoyed about the hole in the wall and the rent I hadn't paid. I didn't explain. What would I even say? That something was living in the walls? That it had eyes that glowed in the dark? Every so often, I catch myself wondering if it's still there, waiting behind that wall. It's tapping unheard by the new tenant. But then I remind myself, it wasn't just a wall. It wasn't just the sound. It was the moment it blinked at me. There's a hiking trail near my town that no one talks about. Not because it's secret, it's marked on maps, even has a name, Haven's Hollow Trail. But people avoid it. When I first moved here, I thought that was weird. A trail like that should have been busy, especially on weekends. Instead, I'd see the other trails crowded with people while Haven's Hollow sat completely empty, like it had been forgotten on purpose. I asked my neighbor about it once. She just shook her head. "You don't go to the Hollow," she said, as if that explained everything. When I pressed her, she looked uncomfortable, muttering something about bad luck, before quickly changing the subject. That was enough to pique my curiosity. I wasn't superstitious, and I didn't believe in curses or ghost stories. If anything, the idea of a creepy trail sounded like fun. So, one cloudy afternoon, I decided to check it out. The entrance to Haven's Hollow was easy to miss, tucked between 2 large oaks at the edge of the state park. The sign was weathered, its letters barely legible. The trail itself was overgrown but passable, winding through dense woods that swallowed the sound of the nearby highway. I'd brought a water bottle, a flashlight, and a healthy dose of skepticism. I told myself I'd walk for half an hour, snap a few photos for social media, and head back. The first 20 minutes were uneventful, peaceful, even. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional rustle of animals in the underbrush. But then the woods began to change. At first, it was subtle, barely noticeable unless you were paying attention. The trees seemed to grow taller, their branches weaving together in a dense canopy that blocked out the light. The air felt heavier, thicker, like it was harder to breathe. I brushed it off as nerves. Then I noticed the silence. No birds, no insects, no rustling leaves. Just me, my footsteps, my breathing. The absence of sound felt oppressive, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't shake. I stopped walking, hoping to hear something, anything, but the silence remained unbroken. That's when I saw the carving. It was etched into the trunk of a tree, deep enough that the bark had healed around it like a scar. It wasn't a word or a name, but a symbol, two concentric circles with jagged lines radiating outward. It reminded me of a sun, but the angles were sharp, almost violent. Something about it made my skin crawl, though I couldn't say why. I snapped a photo and kept walking, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling spreading through my chest. The farther I went, the stranger things became. The trail twisted in ways that didn't make sense, looping back on itself even though I hadn't turned around. The trees seemed to lean closer, their gnarled branches reaching out like fingers. At one point, I passed a cluster of mushrooms growing in a perfect circle on the ground, their caps bright red and speckled with white. I thought about fairy tales, about warnings to stay out of fairy rings, and hurried past without looking too closely. Then I saw the man. He was standing about 50 feet ahead, his back to me. He wore a dark jacket, and his arms hung limply at his sides. Something about his posture was wrong. Too stiff, like a mannequin. "Hello?" I called out, relief and nervousness warring in my voice. He didn't move. "Hey, are you okay?" Still no response. I took a cautious step closer. The trail curved slightly, and as I moved, his profile came into view. My stomach dropped. His face was pale and blank, utterly featureless. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth, unbroken skin stretched tight over bone. I stumbled back, heart pounding, but when I blinked, he was gone. Just empty woods where he'd been standing a moment before. Panic set in. I turned around, ready to head back the way I came, only to find that the trail behind me had disappeared. The dirt path I'd been following was gone, replaced by a wall of trees so dense it was impossible to see through them. I spun in a circle, disoriented, but every direction looked the same. Endless woods, shadows pooling beneath the trees. The symbol was on another tree, etched deep into the bark. This one looked fresher, the lines sharper. I don't know how long I wandered after that. Time felt slippery, like I'd stepped out of reality and into some other place where clocks didn't work. My phone battery drained rapidly, despite being at 80% when I started, and my flashlight flickered weakly before dying altogether. The woods began to close in, the air thick with the smell of rot. Shapes moved in the corners of my vision, vanishing whenever I turned to look. I thought I heard voices, faint and far away, but the words were garbled, distorted, like a recording played backward. And then I found the clearing. It wasn't large, just a small patch of bare earth surrounded by trees. At the center was a stone altar, weathered and covered in moss. Symbols like the one I'd seen earlier were carved into its surface, though these were accompanied by others I couldn't decipher. Something was on the altar. A bundle of sticks tied together with red thread, like a crude doll. As I stepped closer, I saw that the thread wasn't thread at all. It was hair, long and dark, tangled with twigs and bits of bone. The air buzzed with an unseen energy, and the ground beneath my feet felt unsteady, like it might collapse at any moment. I didn't touch it. I couldn't. The sight of it filled me with a primal fear so strong it made my hands shake. A sound broke the silence, laughter, soft and hollow, coming from everywhere and nowhere. I ran. I don't remember how I found my way out. One moment, I was tearing through the woods, branches clawing at my face and arms. The next, I was stumbling out onto the main trail, gasping for air as sunlight hit my face. I haven't gone back to Haven's Hollow. I don't think I ever will. The photo of the carving was gone from my phone when I checked, though I know I took it. Sometimes, late at night, I dream about the altar and the faceless man. When I wake up, I swear I can hear faint laughter, somewhere in the distance. For as long as I can remember, my shadow hasn't belonged to me. It moves the way shadows are supposed to, most of the time. Stretching when I stretch, lagging just a little behind when I walk under streetlights. But it isn't mine. Not really. I've known this since I was a child, though I couldn't have explained it then. It's not something you talk about, even when you're young. No one would believe you. No one would understand. I grew up pretending it didn't bother me, this thing tethered to my feet. I learned to ignore the way it flickered too quickly at the edge of my vision, or held its shape a little too long after I turned a corner. I never let myself think about the way its hands were sharper than mine. The fingers just slightly too long, its shoulders curving at angles I couldn't replicate. The worst thing you can do is let it know you've noticed. That's the rule I've lived by my whole life. And for years, it worked. I made it through childhood, through awkward school dances and late nights out with friends, all while pretending my shadow wasn't something to be afraid of. I got good at it, at ignoring the impossible. Until 3 weeks ago. It happened at work. The office was quiet, the kind of empty that only happens when everyone else has left for the weekend. I was finishing up a report when I noticed the reflection in my monitor. Not me behind me. My shadow. It stood where it always did, clinging to the back of my chair. But something was off. Its head was tilted just slightly, like it was curious. Watching. I shifted in my chair, testing it. The shadow followed, matching my movements as it should. But when I stopped, it didn't. For just a second, it stayed still, frozen in its tilted pose. Then it snapped back, too fast, as if nothing had happened. My stomach churned, a cold knot forming deep inside me. I closed my laptop and left without finishing the report. That night, I dreamt of empty streets. The kind where every window is dark, every car abandoned. My footsteps echoed unnaturally, sharp and hollow. But when I turned to look behind me, I saw nothing. No shadow, no sound, just endless, empty pavement stretching into the dark. When I woke, I was standing in the middle of my living room, barefoot and shivering. The days that followed blurred together in fragments. I started noticing small things. My reflection in windows lagging just a fraction too long before it mimicked me, or the way my shadow seemed sharper under the streetlights at night. I avoided mirrors entirely, convinced I'd see something that shouldn't be there. And then, the knocks began. They came at odd hours, always when I was alone, always at the same rhythm. 3 quick knocks, a pause, and then 2 more. I never answered the door. The first time it happened, I checked the peephole, expecting to see some bored neighbor or a delivery left on my doorstep. But there was nothing, just the empty hallway, stretching out in both directions. The second time, I didn't check. By the third, the knocks weren't coming from the door anymore. They started in the walls, soft at first, like something testing its boundaries. Then they grew louder, closer. They moved with me from room to room, always stopping just before I could pinpoint their source. Once, as I lay in bed, the knocking came from directly beneath me. I leapt to my feet, but the floor was solid, unmoving. That's when the voices started. They weren't voices, exactly. Not words. Just faint, overlapping murmurs that drifted in and out like smoke. I couldn't understand them, but they filled the silence in my apartment, weaving between the knocks and the flickering lights. One night, I woke to find my shadow standing at the foot of my bed. It wasn't attached to me anymore. The air felt wrong, thick and oppressive, like the moment before a thunderstorm. The shadow stood motionless, its shape faintly distorted, as if it were struggling to hold itself together. Its edges flickered like static. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. It stepped closer. For the first time in my life, I saw its face, or something like a face. 2 hollow impressions where eyes should have been, a jagged curve that might have been a mouth. It didn't smile. It didn't need to. The next thing I remember is waking up on the floor, my body drenched in sweat. The shadow was back where it should have been, stretching across the wall behind me as sunlight filtered through the blinds. But something was different. I felt it, deep in my chest, a gnawing certainty. It wasn't pretending anymore. The following days were a haze of paranoia and exhaustion. I stopped going to work. I couldn't explain what was happening, not without sounding insane, so I didn't try. The knocks continued, though less frequently now. The murmurs faded, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed against me from every side. I tried leaving the apartment, once. As I stepped outside, the world felt wrong. The colors were muted, the sky too bright, and the shadows of trees seemed to stretch toward me, reaching. I ran back inside, slamming the door behind me. Now, I'm sitting here, writing this. The lights are flickering again, the air growing colder. My shadow hasn't moved in hours, but I can feel it watching, waiting. I don't know what it wants, but I think it's tired of pretending. I never should have agreed to house sit for the Wards. They were nice enough, overly nice, the way people are when they're asking for a favor they know is ridiculous, but the money was too good to turn down. 2 weeks in their sprawling, ultramodern house while they honeymooned in Europe? Fine. Watching over a house isn't exactly backbreaking labor. The house itself was a statement, perched on the edge of a wooded hill like it had grown there instead of being built. Its walls were all glass and steel, with sprawling, open spaces inside that made you feel exposed no matter where you stood. The Wards had no curtains, no blinds, just those massive panes of glass offering uninterrupted views of the surrounding forest. During the day, the effect was stunning. At night, though, the windows became black mirrors, swallowing the light and reflecting only your face back at you. On the first night, I stood in the kitchen, staring out into the dark trees while the kettle boiled. The house was silent, save for the faint hum of the fridge and the occasional creak of the steel beams settling. I told myself the dark was just that, dark. No reason to feel uneasy. No one could see in from the woods. I was the only person out here, or so I thought. The first strange thing I noticed was the thermostat. I turned it down to 68 before bed, but when I woke the next morning, it was back up to 75. I figured it was on some automatic setting I hadn't figured out yet, and ignored it. But that afternoon, I found it set to 80. I adjusted it again, and within an hour, it had climbed back up. It wasn't just inconvenient, it was unnerving. By the second night, the small oddities began piling up. I'd set my phone on the kitchen counter before bed, only to find it on the dining table the next morning. The fridge door was ajar, though I knew I'd shut it. A glass I hadn't used sat in the sink, a faint ring of condensation marking where it had stood on the counter. The next evening, I noticed the cameras. They were sleek and nearly invisible, tucked discreetly into corners and along the ceilings. I hadn't paid attention to them during the tour the Wards had given me, but now they felt intrusive, as though the house itself were watching me. When I opened the app they'd given me to check the feeds, the cameras all displayed the same thing. Black screens with a single blinking in the center. I called the Wards to ask about the cameras. Mrs. Ward's voice was breezy, laughing over the sound of clinking glasses. "Oh, don't worry about those. They're just for show." Colin stalled them to impress his friends. "They're not even hooked up to anything." That didn't explain the blinking dot. It pulsed steadily, like a heartbeat. By the fourth night, I wasn't sleeping well. The sense of being watched had grown unbearable, even though I was supposedly alone. I kept waking in the middle of the night, certain I'd heard something. A faint knock, a scrape of metal, the rustling of leaves against glass. The windows, those enormous black voids, felt like eyes watching me as I lay in bed. I stopped using the bedroom entirely after that. I moved into the living room and slept on the couch, the TV playing softly in the background to drown out the silence. But the house didn't care. It crept closer, intruding on the edges of my sanity. The thermostat wasn't just adjusting itself anymore. It was fluctuating wildly. I'd wake up shivering, the display reading 50 degrees, only for it to climb to 90 within minutes. Lights turned on and off at random. I heard faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the glass walls, but when I checked, nothing was there. Once, I thought I saw a figure in the woods, standing motionless between the trees. But when I blinked, it was gone. The cameras were the worst. I'd stopped checking the feeds, but the blinking dots had spread. Now every monitor in the house, the TV, my phone, even the tablet left on the kitchen counter, displayed that same pulsing dot. It followed me, no matter where I was. On the seventh night, I heard the stairs creak. I'd been in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, my eyes heavy with exhaustion. The sound jolted me upright, a deliberate groan of wood, like weight shifting on the step. I grabbed a knife, holding it in front of me like it would make a difference, and crept toward the stairs. My heart was pounding, but the house was silent again. Halfway up the stairs, I heard the hum. It was faint, almost imperceptible, coming from the room at the end of the hall. I hadn't gone into that room since I arrived. The wards had mentioned it was a storage space, nothing interesting. But now, the door was ajar, the hum growing louder with each step I took. Inside, the room was empty, just a large, blank space with bare walls and a single steel beam running through the center. The hum was coming from a panel in the wall, its surface smooth and featureless except for a faint glow. I stepped closer, drawn in by the sound, and pressed my hand against it. The panel slid open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into the dark. I should have left, walked out the front door, and never looked back, but I couldn't. Something about the staircase called to me, its walls lined with faintly glowing symbols that pulsed like the dots on the cameras. At the bottom, I found a room that didn't belong. It wasn't part of the house, couldn't be. The ceiling was too high, the walls too wide. In the center stood a chair, sleek and modern, with straps hanging limply at its sides. Around it were monitors, each one displaying a different part of the house. And on every screen, I saw myself. Not live footage, but me. Hundreds of versions of me. Sitting, standing, walking through the house. Some of the versions were wrong. Slightly older, slightly younger, wearing clothes I didn't own or smiling with teeth that were too sharp. I stumbled back, my heart hammering. The monitors flickered, and for the first time, one of the figures turned. Its eyes met mine through the screen, and it smiled. I ran. Out of the basement, out of the house, into the woods. The glass walls glowed faintly behind me, the monitors still flickering. I didn't stop until I reached the road, gasping for air. I tried to tell someone, a friend, the police, but when we returned, the house was empty. The screens were blank, the hum silent. The wards called the next day, apologizing for any inconveniences. They sounded calm, cheerful, as though nothing had happened. I didn't take the money, but sometimes I'll catch my reflection in a window or a screen and wonder, just for a moment, if the person staring back is me. The box wasn't meant to be found. That much was clear the moment Mia pulled it from the hollow tree. The wood had warped around it, as though the tree had been trying to absorb it, to reclaim it as its own. The lock was rusted, but the hinges had held firm, and the carvings along its surface, an intricate weave of symbols that seemed to twist when you weren't looking directly at them, were so precise they looked almost alive. She hadn't gone into the forest looking for anything in particular. It was a place she wandered when her thoughts became too loud, when the weight of unfinished plans and unspoken words made her chest feel tight. The woods had always been a refuge, the kind of place where time moved differently, slower somehow. But the box changed everything. She shouldn't have taken it. She knew that even as her hands closed around the cool, damp wood. The moment it left the hollow, the air grew colder, thinner, as though the forest had inhaled sharply and was now waiting to see what she would do. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and before she could talk herself out of it, Mia was already walking back toward her car, the box heavy in her arms. At home, it sat on her kitchen table, looking smaller than it had in the woods. She circled it for a while, unwilling to touch it again. Up close, the carvings were more distinct. Loops and sharp angles, some intersecting, others spiraling inward like the path of water down a drain. They reminded her of something. Maps, maybe, or the diagrams her father used to sketch in his old astronomy journals. She resisted the urge to trace them with her finger. The lock was broken, but the box wouldn't open. She tried, gently at first, then with more force, but the lid wouldn't budge. It wasn't stuck so much as it seemed disinterested in the idea of being opened. Frustrated, she leaned back in her chair, staring at it as though she could will it to reveal its secrets. That was when she heard the whisper. It wasn't a voice, not really. More like a thought that wasn't hers, slipping into her mind like an uninvited guest. Turn the box. Her pulse quickened. She scanned the room as though expecting to find someone standing in the shadows, but she was alone. Just her and the box and the hum of the refrigerator in the corner. She reached out hesitantly, her hand hovering over the carvings, and tilted the box onto its side. The carvings shifted, not like the way shadows shift when you change angles, but a true movement, as though the lines were rearranging themselves. They folded and expanded, breaking apart and reforming into something new, something that made her stomach lurch as though gravity had briefly forgotten how to work. She yanked her hand back, but the box continued to change, its surface rippling like the reflection of a shattered mirror. And then, with a soft click, the lid opened. She leaned forward cautiously, her breath shallow. Inside was a stone, dark and polished, no bigger than a plum. It seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, a void so perfect it made her eyes ache. She reached for it instinctively, her fingers brushing its surface, and the world shifted. The kitchen dissolved. She was somewhere else now, somewhere vast and endless and cold. The air here felt thick, like she was moving through water, though she wasn't sure if she was moving at all. Shapes swirled in the distance, massive, indistinct things that defied logic and reason. They pulsed faintly, like stars on the verge of collapse. The voice came again, clearer this time. "You have taken it." She turned, though she wasn't sure if her body still existed in this place. The voice wasn't coming from one of the shapes. It was the place itself, speaking directly into her mind. "I didn't know," she said, the words tumbling out before she could think. "I didn't mean to." "It does not matter," the voice interrupted, its tone neither cruel nor kind. "You have taken it, and now it must be carried." "Carried where?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. The void rippled, and the shapes in the distance grew sharper. She could see them now, towers, impossibly tall and twisting, their surfaces alive with shifting patterns that mirrored the carvings on the box. They stretched endlessly in every direction, as though the horizon itself had become a labyrinth. "The burden is yours now," the voice said. "The path is yours to walk." Before she could respond, the cold surged, wrapping around her like a second skin. The towers dissolved, the void collapsed inward, and she was back in her kitchen, the stone still in her hand. It felt heavier now, its weight pressing into her palm like a promise she didn't want to keep. The box sat open on the table, empty but no less menacing. She placed the stone back inside, but the lid wouldn't close. The carvings had shifted again, forming new patterns that seemed to pulse faintly, as though alive. Mia sat back, her heart pounding. She didn't know what she'd taken or what it wanted, but she knew one thing for certain. It wasn't finished with her yet. The job offer came out of nowhere, and I was desperate enough to take it without asking too many questions. It was a 2-month contract for inventory management at a defunct research facility located deep in the mountains. They were offering triple my usual rate, plus housing on site. The idea of being isolated didn't bother me. In fact, it sounded ideal. No distractions, no office politics, just me, a task list, and silence. The facility was massive, a sprawling concrete relic from the 70s with rust-streaked walls and an aura of abandonment. I arrived on a cold afternoon, and the wind howled through the empty parking lot as I hauled my suitcase toward the building. Inside, I was met by a woman named Clara, the project manager who had been overseeing the cleanup. She looked tired, like someone who had been carrying a weight too heavy for too long. "Most of the staff left months ago," she explained as she handed me a key card. "You're one of the last hires. All we need is a complete inventory before the place shuts down for good." I nodded, eager to start. The facility was so vast and empty that I immediately felt like the sole inhabitant of a forgotten city. Clara gave me a brief tour, pointing out the dormitory where I'd be staying, the cafeteria, long since abandoned, and the records room where I'd be spending most of my time. When she left that evening, I felt the silence swallow her absence. The first few days were uneventful. My job was tedious but straightforward. cataloging boxes of old equipment and files. Most of the rooms I worked in had a cold, sterile feel, as though they hadn't seen life in decades. But there were moments, small, fleeting ones, that unsettled me. A door I was sure I'd closed would be ajar when I turned back. A file folder I just organized would be missing, only to reappear hours later in the wrong place. I told myself it was fatigue or distraction. There was no one else here. After all, by the end of the first week, I'd settled into a rhythm. Each evening, after finishing my work, I'd return to my dormitory, a narrow room with a single bed and a desk, and read until I fell asleep. One night, as I was flipping through a book I'd brought, I heard a faint sound in the hallway. It was soft, rhythmic, like the shuffle of feet. I froze, listening. The noise continued for a few seconds, then stopped abruptly. I opened the door, half expecting Clara to be back for some reason, but the corridor was empty. The sound repeated the next night, and the night after, always faint, always distant, always stopping just as I built up the nerve to investigate. I rationalized it as the building settling or the wind slipping through cracks in the old structure. But it didn't sit right. The next week, I started working in a section of the facility that Clara had called off-limits during my orientation. She hadn't been clear about why. It wasn't locked, and my keycard worked fine. I'd assumed it was just more storage, and since my task was to inventory everything, I ventured in. The off-limits section was colder, darker. The air felt heavier, as though the walls had absorbed something unpleasant. Many of the rooms were stripped bare, but others were filled with strange equipment. Tanks with broken glass, machines I couldn't identify, shelves lined with unlabeled jars. The deeper I went, the more bizarre the remnants became. In one room, I found rows of monitors, all smashed, their screens jagged like teeth. In another, a dry erase board covered in symbols and equations that made no sense to me. Then I found the chair. It sat in the center of a room that was otherwise empty. A single, metal chair bolted to the floor, its surface scarred and rusted. Around it were marks on the concrete, deep grooves like something heavy had been dragged in circles. I didn't stay in that room long. That night, the shuffling sound was louder. It didn't stop when I opened the door this time. Instead, it grew closer. I stood in the doorway, my breath caught in my throat, as a shadow moved at the far end of the hallway. It was faint, almost indistinct, but unmistakable. Someone, or something, was there. Hello? My voice cracked, breaking the silence. The shadow didn't respond. It just stopped moving, watching, or waiting. I slammed the door and locked it, spending the rest of the night with my back pressed to the wall, gripping the flashlight I'd found in a supply closet. By morning, the hallway was empty. I told Clara about it the next day, trying to mask my unease. She looked at me for a long time, her tired eyes unreadable. Then she said something I didn't expect. "Have you been to the off-limits section?" I hesitated, then nodded. She exhaled sharply, rubbing her temples. "You shouldn't have. That part of the facility, it wasn't just storage. It's where they worked on the classified projects." "What kind of projects?" I asked. Clara shook her head. "I don't know, and I don't want to know. My job was just to get the place cleared out." "But," she trailed off, glancing around as if someone might overhear, "there were rumors. People said the experiments they did here weren't ethical, that they left something behind." "Left what behind?" My voice was barely above a whisper. Clara didn't answer. She just stood and walked out, leaving me alone with 1,000 questions and no one to ask. That night, the noises escalated. It wasn't just shuffling anymore. It was banging, loud, insistent thuds that echoed through the dormitory walls. The lights flickered, and the air felt charged, almost electric. I locked myself in the room again, heart pounding, as the banging moved closer. When it reached my door, I could hear breathing. Low, raspy, deliberate. "Stop," I whispered, as though it could hear me. "Go away." The banging stopped. The breathing didn't. I don't remember falling asleep, but when I woke, the dormitory was silent. I packed my things and left that morning, ignoring Clara's protests about my contract. I didn't care about the money anymore. I didn't care about anything except getting as far away from that place as possible. A month later, I received a package in the mail. No return address, no note. Inside was a single item, a photo of the room with the chair. Only now, the chair wasn't empty. Something sat in it, blurred and indistinct, but its outline was unmistakably human. I don't know who sent it. I don't want to know. All I know is that I keep the lights on at night now, and I haven't opened another package since. The man showed up on a Tuesday, though showed up might be the wrong phrase. He wasn't there one moment and was the next, sitting on the bench outside my office building with the kind of stillness that felt deliberate. I noticed him through the glass doors as I left for lunch, his pale coat too heavy for the mild weather, his head tilted slightly back, like he was listening to something just out of range. He didn't look at me as I passed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was aware of me. That should have been the end of it, a stranger on a bench, part of the city's endless backdrop. But when I came back an hour later, he was still there, sitting in the exact same position. His coat looked heavier now, his face oddly blurred, as if I couldn't quite bring it into focus. I hurried inside, brushing off the vague unease. The first real shift happened that night. My apartment felt wrong, not in a way I could easily describe. Everything was in its place. The keys on the counter, the jacket on the chair, but the air carried a weight it hadn't before. I turned on the TV to drown out the quiet, but the sound was garbled, words blending into static no matter what channel I picked. When I turned it off, the quiet seemed worse. I slept badly, waking twice to the sound of footsteps in the hall outside my door. Each time, I crept to the peephole, heart pounding, only to find the hallway empty. On the third time, I stayed in bed, too afraid to look again. The next morning, he was there. The man in the pale coat stood at the corner of my street, leaning casually against a lamppost. He wasn't looking at me, but I knew he'd been waiting. His presence vibrated at the edges of my mind, something my instincts couldn't ignore even as I tried to. I hurried past him, eyes fixed on the pavement, and didn't look back. By the end of the week, he was everywhere. I saw him in reflections, just out of focus in shop windows or the chrome curve of a coffee machine. Once, I spotted him in the reflection of my own glasses as I glanced at my monitor. His face was clearer now, sharp, angular, the kind of features that belonged on statues or in nightmares. At night, I dreamed of corridors, endless hallways lined with doors that didn't open, their handles cold under my hand. I walked them endlessly, searching for something I couldn't name. He was always there, at the far end, his pale coat almost glowing in the dim light. The first time he spoke to me, it was a whisper in a crowd. I was on the subway, crushed between strangers, when his voice slid into my ear, soft and deliberate. "You're not supposed to be here." I spun around, heart racing, but there was no one behind me, no one even close enough to have said it. The train jolted to a stop, and I stumbled out at the next station, shaking. By then, reality had begun to twist in ways I couldn't ignore. Time skipped like a scratched record, hours disappearing in a blink or stretching endlessly. My apartment rearranged itself subtly, objects appearing or vanishing without explanation. Once, I came home to find the windows on the wrong walls, the view outside unfamiliar and unsettling. The worst was the mirror. I'd avoided looking at myself for days, unwilling to confront the growing certainty that my reflection wouldn't match. When I finally did, I understood why. The face staring back wasn't mine. It was close enough that I might have missed it in passing, but the eyes were wrong. They didn't blink when I did, didn't shift or track the way they should. They were darker than mine, colder, and they watched me with an intensity that made my chest tighten. "I don't want to see you anymore," I whispered, my breath fogging the glass. The reflection didn't answer. It just smiled. The man appeared in my apartment that night, standing in the corner of the room as if he'd always been there. His presence pressed against me, heavy and suffocating, though he didn't move or speak. "What do you want?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. He tilted his head, studying me with those sharp, unrelenting eyes. "You should have stayed where you belonged," he said, his voice low and even. "I don't understand. You don't need to." He stepped closer, the weight of him filling the room like a thunderstorm. "You saw something you weren't meant to see. And now you've been seen. I didn't. Yes, you did. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, round object. It was a pocket watch, its face cracked, its hands frozen at midnight. Time's wrong for you now. That's why you can feel it. I took a step back, my breath hitching. What happens now? He smiled faintly, the expression more predator than human. That's not up to me. The lights flickered, and the next thing I knew, I was standing in the middle of the street outside my apartment. The air was cold and sharp, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones. My hands were empty. The watch wasn't in my pocket, but sometimes I hear it ticking, faint and steady, in the quiet moments. He's still out there, watching me from the edges of my life. His presence a shadow I can't shake. The reflection in my mirror doesn't belong to me anymore. The corridors in my dreams feel closer, more familiar, like I've walked them 1,000 times before. And the watch keeps ticking, always ticking. I noticed the tree for the first time on a Sunday afternoon. I had lived in the house for 3 years and had walked that same stretch of road dozens of times. It was a quiet little cul-de-sac where nothing more exciting than a stray cat ever seemed to happen. Yet somehow, I had never seen the tree before. It was enormous, towering over the neighboring homes like an ancient guardian. Its bark was dark and twisted, the gnarled branches reaching skyward like skeletal hands. It stood in the yard of the abandoned house at the end of the street. That house had been empty for years, its windows boarded and its paint peeling in strips. The tree looked far older than the house, though. It looked old enough that it shouldn't have just appeared overnight. I stopped and stared at it for a long time, feeling an odd sort of pull. The longer I looked, the more it seemed to demand my attention. There was something carved into the trunk, faint but unmistakable. An intricate symbol that spiraled and intersected in ways that made my head ache if I focused too long. A chill ran through me, and I forced myself to keep walking. But for the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that the tree was watching me. The dream started that night. In the first one, I was standing beneath the tree. The world around me was still and soundless, the air thick and damp like the moments before a storm. The branches seemed to writhe, though there was no wind. I reached out to touch the bark, but as my fingers made contact, a low hum filled the air. It wasn't a noise exactly. It was more like a vibration in my bones. Then I woke up, drenched in sweat. I told myself it was just a dream, nothing more. But the next morning, when I walked past the tree again, I saw something that made my stomach twist. The carving on the trunk, it had changed. The symbol was no longer faint. It was deeper, darker, the grooves sharp and fresh as though someone had just etched them. And now, there were more of them, spreading outward from the original in a chaotic web. I didn't stop to look for long. I hurried past, keeping my eyes fixed on the sidewalk, but I could feel the weight of the tree's presence pressing against my back. By the end of the week, the dreams had grown more vivid. Every night, I was beneath the tree, the hum growing louder, more insistent. In one dream, I saw faces in the bark, their expressions frozen in silent screams. In another, the roots broke free from the ground, twisting toward me like living things. The tree wasn't just in my dreams, though. Strange things began happening around the neighborhood. Mrs. Delaney, my neighbor, disappeared without a word. One day she was tending her garden, and the next her house was dark and empty. The mail piled up on her porch, untouched. Then the dogs started howling. Every night, without fail, the neighborhood dogs would wail in unison, their cries echoing through the street. It always began just after sunset, and it always ended abruptly, as though someone had flipped a switch. I tried to ignore it all, to tell myself it wasn't connected. But the tree was growing. I don't know how I missed it at first, but each day it seemed taller, its branches spreading wider. The roots were creeping too, snaking across the yard and cracking the sidewalk. By the second week, they had reached the edge of the road. The carvings spread with them. They weren't just on the trunk anymore. They covered the roots, the branches, even the leaves. And they weren't random. They were deliberate, a language I couldn't understand but felt in my gut. One night, unable to stand it any longer, I decided to get closer. Armed with a flashlight, I crept down the street under the cover of darkness. The air grew colder the closer I got, and the humming sound from my dreams returned, faint but unmistakable. When I reached the tree, I hesitated. Up close, it was even more massive, its trunk like the pillar of some ancient cathedral. The carvings glistened as though wet, and the bark seemed to pulse beneath the beam of my flashlight. I reached out, just as I had in the dream. The bark was warm, almost hot, and it pulsed beneath my hand like a heartbeat. The humming grew louder, filling my ears, my chest, my entire body. I yanked my hand back and stumbled away, but something followed me home. That night, the dreams changed. I wasn't beneath the tree anymore. I was inside it. The walls were dark and alive, shifting and closing in around me. I could hear whispers now, countless voices speaking in unison, their words just beyond my understanding. The next morning, I found something on my doorstep, a small, gnarled branch, carved with the same symbols that covered the tree. I didn't touch it. By the third week, the tree's roots had reached my house. They twisted up the foundation, wrapping around the porch like grasping fingers. The neighborhood was silent now. No dogs, no people, just me and the tree. I've stopped sleeping. I don't go outside. The carvings have started appearing inside the house, etched into the walls, the furniture, my own skin. The tree doesn't need me to come to it anymore. It's already here. There's a forest near my town that no one enters after sunset, not because of some old legend or superstition, but because something feels fundamentally off about it. The trees are too close together, their branches twisting unnaturally, and the paths always seem to shift when you try to navigate them. People joke about the moving woods during the day, but no one laughs at night. I used to think it was all ridiculous until my dog, Jasper, bolted into those woods 2 weeks ago. It happened during an evening walk on the trail that skirts the forest's edge. Jasper froze, his ears perked, and before I could grab his leash, he took off into the trees. I shouted after him, my voice echoing strangely, but he didn't stop. Jasper's a smart dog. He always comes back. But this time, he didn't. After a few frantic minutes, I stepped into the forest. The first thing I noticed was the cold. Not the usual coolness of evening air, but something biting and damp, like the temperature had dropped 20 degrees. The second thing was the silence. It wasn't just quiet, it was absolute. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, no distant hum of traffic. Just me and my own shallow breathing. "Jasper," I called, my voice sounding unnaturally loud. "Come on, boy." The trees swallowed my words, offering nothing back. I went deeper, gripping my phone for light. The beam was weak, but it revealed enough to keep me moving. Roots snaking across the ground, moss clinging to the bark like veins. The air smelled strange, a mix of damp earth and something sharp, almost metallic. Then I saw him. Jasper was standing perfectly still about 10 yards ahead, his back to me. Relief flooded through me, and I hurried forward. "Jasper, what the hell? You scared me." He turned. His eyes caught the glow of my phone's flashlight, and for a second, I thought I saw something wrong in his expression. Jasper was usually full of energy, always wagging his tail, always bounding up to greet me. But now, he just stared. His head tilted slightly, his body rigid. "Come here, boy," I said, my voice trembling. He didn't move. That's when I noticed the shadows around him. They didn't move like they should. The light from my phone caught the edges of them, and they seemed to ripple, almost stretching toward him. I froze. Something whispered. It wasn't Jasper. The sound came from somewhere behind me, faint but unmistakable, like wind moving through reeds, only it carried words I couldn't understand. "Jasper, let's go," I said louder this time. My hands were shaking. He didn't respond. He just kept staring, his body unnaturally stiff, his head tilted at an impossible angle. Then, slowly, he turned and walked deeper into the woods. I followed him. I don't know why. I should have left, but something about the way he moved compelled me. His paws didn't make a sound against the forest floor, and the shadows that clung to him seemed darker now, like they were feeding off the dim light of my phone. The deeper I went, the worse it got. The trees around me began to change. Their bark was no longer rough and brown but smooth, pale, almost like flesh. Branches reached out overhead, intertwining into a canopy that blocked out the stars. Jasper disappeared. I didn't see where he went. He was just gone. I stopped, my chest heaving, my flashlight darting in every direction. "Jasper!" I screamed. The whispering returned, louder this time, closer. It wasn't one voice anymore. It was dozens, overlapping, murmuring, laughing. The shadows moved. I spun around, and for a split second, I saw them. Figures, tall and thin, just on the edge of the light. They didn't walk, they glided, their forms flickering like static on an old TV. Their faces, if you could call them that, were blank, just smooth expanses of skin with no eyes, no mouths. My phone flickered, and the light went out. I ran. I don't remember how I found my way back, only that the trees seemed to part for me, their branches pulling away just enough to let me stumble through. When I burst out onto the trail, the air felt lighter, warmer, and the distant hum of the town reached my ears. I collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath. Jasper was sitting there, waiting for me. At first, I was too relieved to question it. He wagged his tail, barked softly, and nuzzled against me like nothing had happened. But when I looked into his eyes, I knew. They were the wrong color. Jasper's eyes had always been a warm brown, but now they were pale, almost gray. And the way he looked at me wasn't the way a dog looks at its owner. It was cold, calculating. I brought him home that night, but things haven't been the same since. Jasper doesn't bark anymore. He doesn't run to greet me when I come home, or beg for food, or do any of the things he used to. He just sits and watches me, his head tilted slightly to the side, like he's waiting for something. Sometimes, at night, I wake up to find him sitting in the corner of my room, staring at me in the dark. And sometimes, I hear the whispering again. It's faint, coming from the woods outside my window. They're waiting. The woods behind my childhood home always had an air of mystery about them. They weren't particularly dense or vast, but they stretched just far enough to make you wonder what lay beyond. My parents warned me to stay out, citing the usual dangers. Uneven ground, wild animals, and the kind of ominous vagueness adults use to scare children into obedience. For years, I obeyed. I was content to gaze at the forest's edge from my bedroom window, imagining secret clearings and hidden trails. When I returned to the house as an adult, the woods didn't seem as intimidating. My parents had passed away, leaving me the home I hadn't visited in over a decade. The first few days were spent sifting through memories, photographs, faded letters, and the little treasures my mother had hoarded. But the woods drew my attention more than anything else. They were darker than I remembered, their trees taller and more gnarled. I couldn't explain it, but the woods felt closer. The first night, I dreamed of them. In the dream, I was walking down a path I didn't recognize, the trees arching above me like a cathedral ceiling. There was no sound, no rustle of leaves, no distant birdsong, just the crunch of my own footsteps. The air felt damp, heavy. Something moved in my peripheral vision, but when I turned, there was nothing there. When I woke, my bedroom window was open, though I distinctly remembered closing it. The breeze that drifted in carried a faint smell of earth and decay. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the house was old, the latch loose. Still, I avoided looking at the woods for the rest of the day. By the end of the week, the dreams had become nightly occurrences. Each time, I ventured deeper into the forest, though I didn't want to. My legs moved without my consent, my body drawn forward by an invisible thread. The trees seemed alive, their trunks writhing slightly when I wasn't looking directly at them. There was always a presence, just out of sight, watching. I began waking with dirt under my fingernails and the taste of moss on my tongue. One morning, I found footprints leading from the woods to my back porch. They weren't mine. The stride was too long, the shape too narrow. I told myself it was an animal, though deep down, I knew better. That night, I decided to end the dreams. Armed with a flashlight and the kind of reckless determination only exhaustion can bring, I stepped into the woods. The air was colder than it should have been, and the ground squelched beneath my boots. The trees seemed to lean in as I walked, their branches stretching just a bit too far. their roots coiling like snakes. The path from my dreams appeared before me, though I had no memory of ever seeing it in the daylight. It wound deeper into the woods, its edges lined with pale, sickly mushrooms. I hesitated, but my feet carried me forward, as if the dreams had trained them to find the way. The further I went, the quieter the world became. My own breathing sounded wrong, too loud, too strained, as though the air itself resisted my presence. Shadows pooled at the base of the trees, darker than they had any right to be. Then I saw it. In the clearing ahead stood a door. It was freestanding, unconnected to any structure, its wood warped and covered in strange carvings. The symbols shifted when I tried to focus on them, their edges melting like ink in water. A brass handle gleamed in the moonlight, polished and inviting. I should have turned back, but I didn't. As I reached for the handle, the forest seemed to exhale, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated in my chest. The carvings on the door glowed faintly, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. When I opened it, there was no room on the other side, just a yawning void, blacker than anything I'd ever seen. The air around me grew colder, and the hum of something vast and ancient filled my ears. Then, from the darkness, something moved. It was not a shape I could comprehend. It shimmered and twisted, like a shadow given life, its form shifting faster than my mind could process. It had eyes, or what I thought were eyes, but they weren't fixed in one place. They rippled across its surface, each one locking onto me with a hunger that made my stomach churn. I stumbled back, letting the door swing shut. The hum stopped, replaced by silence so profound it pressed against my ears. I ran. When I finally burst out of the woods, the house looked different. The roof sagged, and the paint peeled in strips, though it had been freshly painted just days before. The air was wrong, too still, too cold. Inside, the clocks had stopped, their hands frozen at 3:13. The photographs on the walls were unfamiliar, showing people I didn't recognize. My own reflection in the hallway mirror looked warped, my features slightly out of place. I tried to leave, but the driveway led only back to the house, no matter how many times I walked it. The road was gone, replaced by dense forest that stretched endlessly in all directions. Now, the door is here. It stands in the living room, where my mother's favorite armchair used to be. The carvings glow faintly at night, and the hum has returned, louder than ever. I don't open it anymore, but I know it's only a matter of time before I do. The first oddity arrived like a misplaced puzzle piece. A small silver charm of a fox, delicate and gleaming, wedged between the cushions of the couch. It wasn't mine. I turned it over in my fingers, thinking maybe it had fallen off a gift or a piece of packaging. It didn't seem important, and I forgot about it until later that evening, when it slipped out of my pocket as I reached for my keys. He noticed. "Where'd you get that?" he asked casually, but his eyes lingered on it a moment too long. "Found it on the couch," I said, holding it up. "Maybe it's from one of your sisters?" He shook his head quickly, almost too quickly. "Probably. Yeah, must be. You know how they leave things everywhere." The lie was so small I almost didn't catch it, like the first crack in a dam. But something about the way he turned back to his phone felt off, like he was holding his breath. The second piece fell into place 2 weeks later, during a late-night run to the store. He had texted me a short list of things we needed: eggs, coffee, dish soap, and when I returned, I found him in the kitchen, cleaning something off his jacket. "Spilled coffee," he said, not looking up, but it wasn't coffee. The smear on the counter was faintly pink, the color of lipstick wiped hurriedly away. I didn't ask. I stood there, holding the groceries, and watched him toss the jacket into the laundry bin with too much force. After that, the signs piled up faster than I could process them. A sudden obsession with cologne, when he'd never worn it before. Unexplained absences that were wrapped in flimsy excuses about errands or long hours at work. His phone became a fortress, guarded with a password I didn't recognize, its screen tilted away whenever I was near. Then there was the humming. At first, I thought it was coming from the refrigerator. A low, vibrating melody I couldn't quite place. But one night, as I lay awake listening to him breathe beside me, I heard it again. a tune so faint it seemed to come from inside my own head. It was haunting and strange, like a song forgotten by time. The next morning, I asked him about it. "Do you hear that? Like humming?" He frowned, his fork halfway to his mouth. "No, you're imagining things." But the humming followed him. I heard it when he was on the phone, when he was in the shower, when he walked through the house late at night. I couldn't decide if it was real or if I was unraveling. The climax came on a rainy Thursday evening. He said he'd be home late, and I believed him, until I saw his car parked at the edge of a narrow road, the headlights dim. He wasn't alone. A figure sat beside him in the passenger seat, their outline blurred by the rain-streaked window. I parked a few yards away, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they ached. The humming grew louder, vibrating in my skull, until I couldn't take it anymore. I stepped out into the rain, walked toward the car, and knocked on the window. He turned, his face pale and startled, and rolled it down just enough for his voice to slip through. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. My heart was racing, not just from anger but from fear. Fear of what I might see if the passenger turned toward me. But the figure didn't move. They sat completely still, their face hidden in shadow. The humming filled the silence between us, growing louder, more insistent. "Get back in your car," he said, his voice low and urgent. I didn't move. "Who is she?" He sighed, the kind of sigh that carries the weight of something too complicated to explain. "It's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is." For a moment, he hesitated. Then he reached out and touched my arm, his hand warm against my rain-soaked sleeve. "You don't want to know," he whispered. Before I could respond, the passenger turned toward me. I froze. Her eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were pools of black, shimmering like oil under a dying sun. Her mouth opened, but no words came out, only the melody, spilling from her lips like smoke. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. The humming was deafening now, a cacophony that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. When I looked back at him, his expression was one of quiet resignation. "Go home," he said softly. "I'll explain later." I didn't go home. I drove aimlessly through the rain, my thoughts spiraling as the humming faded into a distant memory. By the time I returned, the house was dark and his car was gone. The next morning, he was back, acting as if nothing had happened. But the spell was broken. I watched him carefully, noting the way he avoided my eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly when he reached for his coffee. The humming never returned. Neither did the figure in his car. But the space between us grew wider with each passing day, filled with unspoken truths and unanswered questions. Eventually, he left. No grand confrontation, no dramatic ending. Just a quiet goodbye and the sound of his suitcase wheels on the floor. Sometimes, I still hear the humming late at night, faint and far away. I wonder if it followed him, or if it was always mine to carry. The first strange thing wasn't the most dramatic, but it was the one that stayed with me. A faint mark on my living room wall. It looked like a smudge of ash, about the size of my hand, in a spot I never touched. I tried scrubbing it off, but no matter how hard I scrubbed, it remained stubbornly faint, as though it wasn't a stain but a shadow that didn't depend on light. I told myself I'd deal with it later. Life moved too quickly for me to get bogged down by an odd bit of wall grime. It wasn't like it was hurting anyone. That night, I had a dream. One of those vague, nonsensical ones you half remember when you wake up. A hallway stretched endlessly in front of me, door after identical door. I kept walking, unsure which one I was supposed to open. And behind me, always just out of view, came the soft tap, tap, tap of footsteps that weren't my own. The next morning, I found a second mark, this one on the ceiling above my bed. By now, I was annoyed more than anything. Marks on walls don't just appear without reason. I climbed onto a chair to take a closer look, but the ceiling was clean, perfectly smooth. The mark wasn't dirt, and it wasn't paint. It was as if the material itself had darkened, the way bruises bloom under the skin. I snapped a picture with my phone, intending to show someone. Maybe a contractor, maybe a friend who could laugh about it with me over drinks. But when I looked at the photo later, the mark was gone. Just blank white ceiling. The next mark appeared on the inside of my bathroom door. This one was longer, almost claw-like, as if someone had dragged their hand down the wood with deliberate force. I hadn't noticed it that morning, and I would have sworn it hadn't been there the night before. By then, it wasn't annoyance I felt anymore. It was unease. I started checking the apartment constantly, inspecting the walls like a landlord with something to prove. Every time I left a room, I half expected to find a new mark when I came back. For days, nothing changed. I convinced myself I'd imagined the earlier marks. Stress and bad lighting, probably. Or maybe I'd always had a streak of overactive paranoia and didn't notice until now. But the dream came back. This time, I wasn't walking. I was running. The hallway stretched on, and the doors were gone, replaced by smooth, featureless walls. Behind me, the footsteps were closer, louder, echoing in a space that seemed much smaller than it had before. I woke up drenched in sweat. The next day, I found the largest mark yet, a jagged, blackened line cutting across the floor of my hallway. It didn't make sense. I lived on the 3rd floor of an apartment building, and the floors were solid wood. But this looked like a scorch mark, as if a blowtorch had sliced through the planks. When I bent down to touch it, I swear I felt heat. I called my building manager, trying to explain in a way that didn't make me sound insane. He listened politely, then said he'd send someone to take a look. No one came. Over the next week, the marks multiplied. They weren't just confined to the walls and floors anymore. I found them on furniture, on the pages of my books, even on my clothes. The same dark smudges, always faint enough to question but undeniable when I ran my fingers over them. I stopped sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, the dream pulled me back into that hallway, the sound of footsteps growing louder and louder until I couldn't hear my own breathing. Then, one night, I opened the door in the dream. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was like my body moved on its own, my hand reaching for the nearest door and pulling it open without hesitation. What I saw inside wasn't a room. It wasn't anything. Just blackness, infinite and smothering, and something moving inside it, so vast I couldn't comprehend its shape. When I woke up, the marks were everywhere. They covered my apartment like a rash, crisscrossing every surface until I couldn't see the original walls anymore. And they weren't faint anymore. They were deep and textured, as if the material of my home was being eaten away by something hungry and unseen. I packed a bag and left. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to get away. But even as I drove, I felt it, the faint pull of those marks, as if they were etched into the back of my mind. I stayed with a friend for a few nights, grateful for the distraction of someone else's space. The first night, I slept dreamlessly, a relief so profound I almost cried. But on the second night, as I brushed my teeth, I noticed something on the bathroom mirror. A faint smudge, just below my reflection's hand. When I touched the glass, my fingers came away clean. The mark was under the surface. I didn't stay a third night. It's been weeks now. I've moved twice, hopping from one temporary rental to another. No matter where I go, the marks find me. They start small, on the corners of windows or the undersides of tables, then spread like veins through everything I own. And the dreams. The hallway has become a fixture in my mind. Even when I'm awake, I can feel it pressing against the edges of my thoughts, waiting for the moment I let my guard down. Last night, I heard the footsteps outside my door. They weren't part of a dream. The marks are on my skin now. I didn't tell anyone about the postcard when it arrived. Not because it was particularly strange, just a vintage print of a lighthouse on a rocky shore, but because it didn't make sense. The postmark was smeared, and there was no return address. My name and apartment number were handwritten in neat, blocky letters I didn't recognize. The back was blank, except for one line in the same handwriting. "You've been here before." At first, I thought it was a mistake, some kind of junk mail gimmick, but the more I stared at it, the more uneasy I felt. The lighthouse in the picture looked familiar in a way I couldn't place, like an itch I couldn't quite scratch. I left the postcard on my kitchen counter and tried to forget about it. That night, I dreamed of crashing waves and cold, salt-streaked wind. The lighthouse from the postcard loomed in the distance, its beam cutting through the dark. I was standing on jagged rocks at the water's edge, the spray soaking my clothes. Something moved in the shadows at the base of the lighthouse, a flicker of motion just out of reach. I woke with a start, my heart pounding. The postcard was no longer on the counter. I found it propped up on my nightstand. I lived alone. The pull. Over the next few days, the dreams persisted. Every night, I found myself on that rocky shore, the lighthouse watching me with its steady, unblinking eye. The figure at its base grew more distinct. A man, his face obscured by the shadow of a hood, his movements deliberate. He never spoke, but his presence filled me with dread, like I was an uninvited guest trespassing on something sacred. In the waking world, the postcard began to change. At first, it was subtle, a faint discoloration in the sky, a slight shift in the angle of the lighthouse. Then the changes became impossible to ignore. A crack appeared in the rocks, spidering outward with each passing day. The water in the image grew darker, the waves more violent. I tried throwing it away. Twice. Both times, I found it back on the counter the next morning, pristine and unchanged. By the end of the week, I was avoiding my own apartment. The unease had burrowed under my skin, making it impossible to concentrate on anything else. I'd sit at work, staring blankly at my computer screen, replaying the dreams in my head. That's when the emails started. The subject lines were always the same. Do you remember yet? The body of each email was empty, but the sender's name chilled me. Redacted. No address, no domain. Just redacted, like a secret too dangerous to reveal. I stopped checking my inbox. The return. The breaking point came the following Saturday. I woke from another dream. This time, the man in the hood had turned toward me. His face was still hidden, but I felt his gaze, heavy and accusing. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't in my bed. I was standing in the kitchen, barefoot on the cold tile floor, the postcard clutched in my hand. The image had changed again. The crack in the rocks had widened into a jagged chasm, swallowing half the lighthouse. The waves churned violently, spilling onto the shore. And in the corner of the image, the hooded figure was there, closer than ever. I knew then that I couldn't avoid it any longer. I had to go. The lighthouse. It took hours of searching, but I finally found it. An abandoned lighthouse on a desolate stretch of coast 2 hours away. There was no mention of it on any map, but a grainy photo in a forgotten forum post confirmed it was the same one from the postcard. The drive out was uneventful, the narrow road winding through barren hills and salt marshes. The sky was overcast, the horizon a dull smear of gray. When I arrived, the lighthouse was exactly as I dreamed. The paint was peeling, the stones weathered and cracked. The air smelled of salt and decay. The closer I got, the heavier the air felt, as though the place was holding its breath. I climbed the rocky path, my legs trembling with each step. The postcard burned in my pocket, its presence an anchor I couldn't shake. The door to the lighthouse was ajar. Inside, the air was damp and stale. The spiral staircase wound upward into darkness, its iron steps groaning under my weight. With each step, the sense of déjà vu deepened, memories brushing the edges of my mind like fleeting shadows. At the top, the light was still. It was impossible, but the beam cast no motion, no sound. It simply hung there, frozen in place. And then I saw him. The hooded man stood by the railing, his back to me. His presence filled the room, a weight that pressed against my chest and squeezed the breath from my lungs. Slowly, he turned. His face was mine. Not a reflection, not a twin, me, exactly as I was. His expression was unreadable, his eyes hollow but knowing. "Do you remember now?" he asked, his voice soft and distant. I couldn't speak. My mind raced, fragments of memories clawing to the surface, stormy nights, desperate cries, the pull of the ocean dragging me under. "You've been here before," he said, stepping closer. "You'll be here again." I stumbled back, my hand brushing against the frozen beam of light. It was cold, impossibly cold, and as my fingers touched it, the world shifted. The lighthouse began to crumble, the floor splitting beneath my feet. The hooded figure, myself, didn't move. His eyes locked on mine as the darkness rose to consume us both. The next beginning. I woke on the rocky shore, the lighthouse looming in the distance. The waves crashed around me, cold and merciless. My clothes were soaked, my hands trembling as I reached into my pocket. The postcard was there, pristine and unmarked. The image was different now. The lighthouse was whole again, the rocks unbroken, the sky clear. But in the corner of the picture, a figure stood at the water's edge. This time, it was me.